Good morning once again to all of you, and welcome back. Here we are in the course of Healthcare Bioethics and the program, the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Always beginning with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful. Kindle in us the fire of your divine love, especially during this Lenten season, that we may make a good preparation for the celebration of Easter. This we pray in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, let me see. Before going any further, any questions or comments? Anything we've covered so far? Looking for the tile. Nice. A minute, still working on the technicalities here. For some reason, I cannot see the tile. Someone has a microphone that is on. I ask you to mute your microphone unless you want to say something. All right. Why is the little tile not appearing? I'm always technically challenged. Well, okay. I don't know. Cannot tell why the Zoom tile is not appearing, but it's not. I hope you can still hear me and see the screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you very much, Alden. And before the actual lecture, it happens that we have the three priests online this morning. So just a little word of encouragement since you're coming. Oh, a couple of points. First of all, graduation commencement ceremony will be in May. And if you're planning on coming to the graduation ceremony, you should have had to apply for graduation back in February. And then there are these graduation expos or expositions for selecting cap and gown, which I believe can also be done online. But the most important first step was to apply for graduation. So have you all done that already? Hope?
I think so, but I'm not quite sure. I feel like I went through something on the student self-service that told us to do that.
But you never got any confirmation. Okay. If you're not sure, if you haven't gotten any confirmation about graduating, send me an email and then I'll do a follow-up this coming week. It happens to be a spring break here. So I don't know if the offices are going to be open or not, but Dr. Martinez is here. Good morning.
Police reported ahead.
Sorry, Kendall? Was that Kendall who chimed in? Hello? Dr. Martinez, did you get any confirmation from the registrar's office about graduation?
Yeah, they sent out an email. Here which said you're receiving this email because you are scheduled for graduation in May.
In May, okay.
And then they give you some to go to the fair, the
Right.
graduation fair, and some
Instructions. Okay.
But going into a little bit, the information I received
Yes.
was that we didn't have to do anything more. That they would reach out to us on that email.
Right.
That email represented that we were okay to go to graduation. So I went to the fair.
Yes, right.
Okay. And you can order your
Cap and gown,
cap
right?
and gowns on there, or you can do it online. But I had financial aid issues, so
Okay.
I have to fix that.
Okay.
And they said, other than that, we were ready for graduation. The only thing I'm not clear on is you get 4 tickets.
Right,
for
4
the
tickets
graduation.
for
I don't think
family.
They wasn't quite clear where you get that. So I have to follow up on
All right. That normally comes with a package. And it's an actual physical package. In the past, they were giving it at the fair, but maybe they're holding off on it. They did not. All right. Okay. Well, that is pending to come.
There's another fair date coming now. I think.
Yes.
next week.
Right. Even though that's supposed to be for the December graduations, but one can still go to those physically here. Right. So it was Father Stephen who was asking the question. Did you ever get an email like that confirming that?
Father Stephen here. I think Father Dan was asking the question, but I received the same email.
Right. Okay. All right. So Father Dan, maybe you want to look for that.
I found it. I got it.
Okay. All right. Good. And while we're on it, I see Christina also. Did you get that email, Christina?
Yes, Father, I did, and I already ordered. Good morning.
Right.
I already ordered my cap and gown.
All right. Okay. So that's done too.
Yes, Father, me too. I got the email.
Franco?
Yes, I received the email. So
okay. All right.
the same email. I just have to go to because I received the email on March 2nd, but the March 1st was the deadline to order it online. I'm going to the campus to do it on next week. It will be now on March 15 or 16.
Right, right. Okay, good. Let me see anyone else online. I don't see anyone else. Okay, so it looks like everyone is on schedule for that. Good. And all right, anything else about graduation? If you are planning to come, then we can make arrangements like that. I'm talking about those who are outside of Miami. Okay, so you can let me know in time to try to make accommodations there. All right, anything else about graduation? Amazing, it's coming up. Yes, the journey is nearing its end. Still a couple of months to go. Okay, I'm going to minimize the tile here. All right, so we're going to get into this topic, and you've been sending me your summaries and so forth, so I can see that you're able to go online and look at the videos. As you know, this one course is team taught by a number of medical doctors, several of whom have taken the program or are taking it now, all right? So I'm very honored really to have that, and each one in their own expertise within the field. This one, so I'm giving 2 of the talks, as you know. One is today on transplantation bioethics, and you'll see the reason for that. I have a little bit of experience on this at a personal level. And the other one is on the pandemic bioethics, also because with some students here at St. Thomas, during the year 2020, we were tracking the pandemic worldwide with data and so forth as it was happening. And we did that online because everything was being done online at that time. So I also have some data there to present, and we'll go from there. So with regards to transplants, bioethics, oh, sorry, let me turn on some lights here so that we get the better screen view. All right. This has to do with organ transplants, or it can also be tissue transplant. Right? So both. The 2 sources obviously are either living organs and tissues or cadaveric, in other words, from the deceased. And here I would invoke the course on the end of life bioethics, end of human life, and the definition that is applicable here for cadaveric transplantation is that alternative definition of death, which is the neurological criterion, if you remember, what we call total brain death. I have a little more to say about that, but basically that would be the justification for doing cadaveric transplantation of vital organs, right? Because by definition, if it's a vital organ and we extract it from a living person, then that would bring on death, which is unethical, of course, and therefore the total brain death definition and criterion is very useful in this whole field of transplanting vital organs from people who have died. Let's go forward just a little bit on the basic definitions here. The transplants can be either autograft or allograft, and autograft or autologous are from the same person. So going to the Greek and the Latin, auto is self, right? So self-donation or basically from one part of the body to another part of the body. This is used mostly for tissues, including adult stem cells from one source of the body into another part. Allograft, which is the most common actually, and the more diverse on organs and tissues, is from another donor. And again, or from a donor, from another person that is not self. Again, either living or cadaveric from a deceased person. And this issue of allograft, which again is the most common and the most diverse, also brings with itself a number of challenges. The first immediate challenge is the immune rejection of that organ or tissue because it's not from the same individual. So the advantage, one big advantage of autograft is that it bypasses immune rejection because it's the same individual, and then the organism does not go into immune rejection. Right? The third category is known as xenotransplantation, and xenotransplantation is from another species, right? From another species. And the most typical here is the heart valves of a pig into the human heart. It happens that the pig's heart is very similar to the human heart, even up to size and so forth. But mostly the valves have been used for quite a while to replace defective human heart valves. Okay. Okay, so going forward, just a review again a little bit from the end of life course. What constitutes vital organs? Just basically review the heart, the kidneys, the liver, the lungs, pancreas. Is the smallest organ that is vital, but it is vital because the pancreas is the one that processes or makes insulin to regulate sugar in the blood, which equates to basically energy for the whole body, for all the organs and tissues of the body. The intestines as a whole, the thymus gland also is a vital organ, and most common for organ transplantation are the kidney, the liver, and the heart. Okay. For living organ transplantation, which is interesting, in other words, this means that a person may donate some part of a vital organ and keep on living, right? The kidney, the liver, and the lungs. Because it turns out that we actually have two kidneys, right? And on a normal functioning person, one can live with one kidney and go forward. The liver, we actually have 3 lobes of the liver, and 1 lobe can be donated while living. And generally, the liver, again, on a normal, healthy person, will regenerate. And the lungs, well, we have 2 lungs, but we actually have 5 lungs. In other words, we have 5 lobes, 2 lobes on one lung and 3 lobes on the other lung, and one can donate 1, maybe even 2 lobes of a lung and keep on living, right? So these are living organ transplants that can be done. I'll have more to say about this a little further down. All right, with regards to tissue, bone marrow, tendons, cornea, skin, heart valves, like I mentioned, nerves, veins, stem cells, and in fact, the bone marrow, which has been going on for decades, bone marrow grafts or transplants used in mostly in blood diseases, has been going on for decades, and it's actually a type of stem cell transplant. Right? Only was not really recognized as such when it was started, but really it does fit into that category. Because what does bone marrow do or make? What's the function of the bone marrow in the body? It makes blood cells, right? White blood cells, red blood cells. And so in leukemias and diseases like that, the bone marrow may be a life-saving procedure. Stem cells, there's an increasing number of sources of stem cells in the body that have been found. Here I'm talking about adult stem cells, obviously, not the embryonic ones, but adult stem cells. And they're found in different parts of the body. We went over this earlier in the end-of-life course. And these can be used either for self or for others, but mostly these are the autologous transplants. The most common tissues that are transplanted are the cornea or in the muscle or the bone systems, the skeletal system or the muscular system. Now, the advantage of tissue transplant in contrast to organ transplant is that tissues may be frozen and therefore, and then banked, right, stored for later use. And they go into a registry. I'll be talking about the registry a little further down, but they go into a registry so that they can be used in other parts of the nation, right, for matching donor and recipient. And that is a great advantage because there is a national registry, if you will, where transplant teams have access to find matches for these various tissues that may be donated. Now, cadaveric organs, they have to be fresh as possible, right? And the lifespan of each organ varies from organ to organ, but generally it's within a 24-hour window of the death of the donor. And by the way, speaking about the death of the donor, typically that is put on the license, right? On the driver's license. When we go to renew our license, or I think it can be done online now, just go online and one can add to be an organ donor. So when there is that tragic accident, God forbid, but it does happen, and it happens daily in the United States. Imagine 350 million people driving around. Well, a little less if we discount the underage, but still hundreds of millions of people driving around on a daily basis. Tragically, there are accidents. It's one of the most common causes of death, unfortunately, car accidents. And if it's a fatal blow to the head, typically there will be a total brain death, right? But from the neck down, the body may be fairly intact, and therefore vital organs can be harvested. And therefore, I always promote having that designation of organ donor on your driver's license, all right? Here, hold for a moment and speak a little bit more here. What is your intuition about the most common cadaveric organ donor here in this area of accidents, traffic accidents? Anyone have an insight? It's a combination between youth and folly. I'm sorry to bring up the issue, but you know it's important for the topic that we're talking about. youth and lack of wisdom. Because usually, in my experience, overall youth and wisdom not necessarily correlate. So, which is the classical, not the heart, the eyes. Oh no, I'm talking about the traffic accident.
The young male.
The young male who's riding what?
Motorcycle.
A motorcycle. The young male riding, speeding on a motorcycle, hitting an object, which could be another car, another motorcycle, anything, any other object that will stop that motorcycle dead on its track. And of course, there's no seatbelt on motorcycles, right? So that fellow is not going to fly through the air until impacting another hard surface at the speed at which he was driving, right? So anything above 30, 40 miles an hour flying through the air is going to be typically a fatal crash. It's going to minimally dislocate the neck, which will mean quadriplegia for the rest of their life, or worse, tragically, what happens with or without helmet, and I see them driving, there's no law for helmets, at least in Dade County. I don't know if it's a state thing, but there's no need for helmets legally. To me, it's just insane. I see them wearing a cap facing backwards, right? As if that's going to prevent a blow to the head. Anyway, that's the typical organ donor, but what is kind of intriguing, frankly, to me, is that a number of these young men who have motorcycles have, in fact, in their license organ donors. They do. They have on their license organ donor. So I don't know. I mean, it's a wild life, right? That they're trying to live anyway. But that is a typical vital organ donor, especially for heart, but also other vital organs of the body. Anyway, enough said about that. We can draw our conclusions. So the organs are transplanted within 24 hours. And of course, there's a rush to harvest the organs when there's a person declared brain dead, right? The neurological criterion with the organ donor designation, or it could be a proxy. It could be a proxy who donates the organ. Again, detain here for a moment because you see the delicate situation. The transplant team has to be totally excluded from the emergency team in ER who's trying to save the life of this person who is coming in critically injured, all right? They have to be totally separate. It's a different team so that we avoid conflict of interest. But that team is just waiting around, and the transplant team at some point need to approach the next of kin. Typically, the patient in the ER is unconscious. We're talking about a very serious situation, blow to the head. And so if there is no organ donor designation on the driver's license, or if the driver's license for some reason doesn't appear, etc., then that team very delicately has to approach or may approach the next of kin or whoever is responsible, if there was a proxy assigned or not. You know, this comes into the whole issue of the designation of a proxy, right? To see if they want to agree to donate the vital organs of their beloved one who is now dying from a blow to the head, okay? And so it's a very delicate situation. They have ways of approaching, basically, when there is no hope of recovery, the hope of at least by the donation of a vital organ to save the life of someone else who is waiting on a waiting list. I have two anecdotes, one about living kidney transplant, and another one about a heart transplant. A friend of mine who is Colombian, by the way, it's a married couple who I know from decades, and he was waiting 10 years for a heart transplant. And it finally came through. 10 years he had to wait. I'll get to that a little further down. So the second part relates some anecdotes. Christina?
So even if you are an organ donor, you need somebody designated to agree?
No, that's when the person is unconscious, when the patient, right, is unconscious. But it's always good to have someone designated ahead of time so that it's not a last minute decision there in the midst of the grief of knowing their spouse or their loved one who is dying from a head injury. Then also on top of that to decide whether to donate the organs or not. Who knows what their wish was, right? So if that wish is stated beforehand, it gives relief to our loved ones, not having to make that decision and trying to figure out, well, what did they want, right? Okay, so all this, what I'm trying to say by all this really is to take seriously that lecture we had on designating a proxy and all that and doing the living will, the Catholic living will, when we talked about the end of life issues. All right, do stop me at any point if you have a question or a comment. Okay, let's stick with the biology a little bit more here, the clinical setting, because I mentioned the typical transplant, of course, is allograft or from one person to another. And therefore, there's the issue of an immune rejection because the body of the recipient detects that organ or tissue as a foreign object coming into the body. It's what is known, I think, as an insult, right? And therefore, the body will mount, the body of the donor of the, the body of the recipient of the patient, of the transplant patient, will mount an immune reaction, which will be pretty aggressive and can even be fatal for the patient himself or herself, right? So they have to do what is known as the match to see how closely their immune system matches. This has to do with factors, proteins, and other factors in the biochemistry of the donor and the recipient to get them to match as closely as possible. Now, again, what's your intuition with regards to familiarity or familial lines, right? Obviously, the more closely related the donor and the recipient are, family-wise, then the more likely the match in general, but not necessarily. Okay, I know cases where parents were not good matches for their children or siblings. Generally, siblings are the best matches, right? But not necessarily, all right? So we really have to go back to patient by patient here. Anyway, there's a whole study that is done, and it's called the PRA, or panel reactive antibody level, the PRA score, panel reactive antibody level, right? They do something that is known as serotyping. Obviously, they take a blood sample on both the donor and recipient, and then do all the biochemistry on it, looking for that perfect match. The match does not have to be perfect, all right? It's on a scale. And at least for kidney, I think the scale is up to about 4. So from 2.5 up, the higher the number, the better the match, right? So like from 2.5 up, it's okay to do the donation, right? 4 being the maximum score. And you seldom get a 4, right? What's your intuition where you get like a 3.5 to a 4? Where you have what?
Too much.
Well, identical siblings, right? Identical monozygotic siblings. Because their DNA is almost identical. We still have to allow for some spontaneous mutation that may have occurred early on in their embryonic development, to have those signature fingerprinting of the two, but that's the best match there, at least on the genetics of it. All right, but even so, if the match is not really perfect, the recipient, right, the patient who's waiting for the transplant, can be put on immunosuppressant drugs. Immunosuppressant, just what the word says, this tones down their immune system. It doesn't shut down the immune system, because the immune system is shut down, then we become vulnerable to any infection. We're constantly breathing in and out bacteria, spores, fungal spores, viruses. That's in the air that we're breathing right now. So our healthy immune system is constantly at work and keeping all that at bay so that we have a normal life, right? But the immune system can be toned down somewhat for the match to work, to be compatible. So it's a balancing act, right? It's a balancing act. There are a number of drugs. A typical one is prednisone, but there are others there, typically steroids, that tone down the immune system on the recipient for the transplant to be possible. Now, there are some things that sensitize the PRA score, right? And the three main ones are previous transplants, sensitizes a person to a further transplant. And then also blood transfusions, because the blood transfusion, unless it's an autologous transfusion, on blood transfusions, they're doing that now for some time, for some years now, because it's getting harder and harder to be able to procure blood donations, right? People, for some reason, there are a number of reasons, but I know that the blood banks are having more and more difficulty getting blood donations. So they have to be creative. And sometimes if the patient is healthy enough, before the operation, the patient will donate blood for their own operation, for their own surgery, right? And so that's a creative way of going around it. And the beauty of that is that that blood will then be, in effect, an autologous transplant. But anyway, a blood transfusion from another donor could also sensitize the immune system, and then the PRA score will be affected by that. And also pregnancy, because in pregnancy, again, looking at the biology of it, looking at the genetics of it, the child within the womb of that mother is 50% compatible and 50% incompatible, right? Because 50% of the chromosomes come from the father, who is not the body of the mother. And therefore, the immune system also begins to get sensitized there with every pregnancy and subsequent pregnancy. So those are the three main cases there where the PRA score is sensitized or higher. Okay, so those are special cases. Medicine has a way of dealing with them, but the bottom line here is to find the match. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we look at the two agencies that manage organ transplantation in the United States. One agency is basically in charge of the donors, and they run a registry, a national registry that is online. For the other agency that is advocating, let's say, on behalf of the recipient of the health of a patient who needs a transplant, to find precisely that match. That could be nationwide, all right? It's done online and so forth. So we'll talk about those two agencies a little further down. Still staying on the biology for now, because I'm going to talk about lung transplant, which is one of the living ones, and heart-lung transplant. Just a brief review of the circulatory system for you to note that what I want to point out by this is that for technical reasons, for reasons of tubing, right, it's easier to transplant the heart and the lungs together as a package than just a lung or both lungs, okay? And you'll see graphically what I mean. So just a very brief review of our circulatory system. Structurally, we talk about systemic circulation or pulmonary circulation, all right? So the pulmonary circulation, as it says, is blood that is going to and from the lungs, from and to the heart. So the heart biologically is a pump, all right? We know that metaphorically has many other meanings and symbols and so forth, but biologically the heart is essentially a pump, like the pump of a pool, right? That keeps the water circulating through the pool. All right, it's a very sophisticated heart. It's a double heart. It's got the 4 chambers and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it keeps the blood circulating. It keeps a fluid circulating through the whole body. And so if you can think of it functionally, one type of circulation is to the lungs, to and from the lungs. And that's for the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange that needs to occur there, right? Release CO2 and pick up O2 at both lungs. And then that blood is pumped through, typically through the aorta, to the systemic circulation. Systemic comes from system or organ systems or the whole body, right? And that circulation is represented here in a very simplified diagram. The upper circulation, the upper systemic to the anything that's above the heart, essentially, the arms and the head, and then the lower circulation, the trunk and the legs down here. All right. So systemic can be subdivided into upper and lower parts with its own dynamics and so forth. Basically, those are the 2 types of circulation. As I say this, think now, since I have the diagram, well, let me go forward to the next, and I'll come back to this diagram in a minute. There are some transplants that are called domino transplants, right? So the whole scenario of organ transplantation is constantly looking at how they can be creative with regards to the match, because sometimes the one-to-one match doesn't happen. In other words, there is a recipient, right? There is a person who needs an organ transplant, like my friend who needed a heart transplant. He was very weak. His heart was down to about a 10 or 15% efficiency. They lived, to this day, they still have a little condo, 2-story down in Homestead. And so the bedrooms, as you know, are upstairs, and the living, everything else is downstairs, right? Including the kitchen, dining room, living room, everything. So they need to come down to eat and then go back up to sleep. And it would take him about half a day to come down the stairs and another half a day to go up the stairs. I mean, we laugh, but he did that for about 10 years. He had some kind of a pump that helped him a little bit, all right? But long term, that wasn't, it was getting diminishing results little by little. So the heart kept degenerating. And so it was quite a challenge. Needless to say, he couldn't go out or anything like that because it was just too stressful. Anyway, the whole idea was the match, right? Now, so one way of getting around the fact that that there's not a perfect match when there is a donor. Oh yes, I forgot to say that in the United States, usually there is a list, a waiting list for all of these transplant patients waiting for a heart, a lung, a liver, pancreas, whatever right organ there is malfunctioning. Okay, and so that waiting list can be bypassed if there is a dedicated donor. In other words, if they find a donor, typically a family member or a friend who donates to them, then they get off the list and they get that dedicated donor, all right? But it may be that the donor who's willing to donate is not a match. Talking about living donations in the cadaveric is different because they're just on the registry waiting for to see if the next cadaver is a possible match, okay? But on the living side, the living donor, if the donor is willing to donate, but it's not a match, what do you do, right? Well, in order not to lose that donor, these agencies have gotten very creative and they do what is known as a domino transplant. In other words, they find another transplant patient who is anonymous, who is unknown to this donor, right, or the recipient, but is a match. It's a match of the donor, but is a stranger to the donor. Doesn't matter because it's about the organs, right? About organs. So that anonymous patient, recipient, also had a donor who was not a match, but it happens that that donor is a match for the first couple, for the first patient, right? And that's what's called a domino or a paired donation. Paired donation most typically is done with kidneys, and getting a little ahead of myself here, but that type of donation is done all 4 surgeries at the same time. Okay, it's called paired donation. It's very interesting, and that's why you can see the utility of this national registry, because that other couple may be across, maybe we're here in Miami and the other couple is over there in Seattle, which is all the way across the US. It doesn't matter, it's just a question of a flight. You know, within a day, they could be in the same surgical theater to do all 4 transplants at the same time, either here or there, or maybe even somewhere in between. All right. So this domino transplant is a very useful thing that can be done, but it's got its risks to it, right? It's got its risks. First, I want to talk about a domino transplant or a paired donation that can happen with the heart and the lung. And it's the one case where a living heart may be donated, okay? And the donor and the recipient both can keep on living. So you think about donating a living heart, you would think that that kills the donor, right? Living heart donation will kill the donor. But there's one exception, and it's a very creative thing, and it has to do precisely with transplanting the heart and the lungs as a package together. Okay? So this is what I mean. The case is with cystic fibrosis, which is a disease of the lungs, and it's a gradual accumulation of mucus on the lungs that eventually will impair the lungs from breathing. So it's gradual, it's degenerative, and to this day, as far as I know, there's no cure to it. Again, the doctors in the house, please correct me anytime I say anything that is out of line with medicine, okay? Because I'm not a doctor, but this is what I've been reading over the years. All right, so CF accumulates that mucus in the lungs, and it makes them harden, and it just fills up the lungs, incapable of breathing, right? So it's a very tragic thing. However, the heart of the CF patient is intact. The heart is okay because it's a disease that is specifically of the lungs, right? Follow that. So that's crucial to know that the heart of the CF patient is intact. It's not affected by the disease, but the lungs definitely are. So what does this CF patient need? What transplant, what organ are they waiting for? They're waiting for lungs, right? Okay, now we have a cadaver, let's say the classical blow to the head, total brain death, but from the neck down, that body, that human body is fairly intact, which means that the heart and the lungs are intact, and let's assume that they are a match, okay? And they had on their license that they're organ donors. Instead of transplanting just the lungs, what I'm saying is that that team will transplant the entire package together, lung and heart, because think about it. To transplant just the lungs, we have to cut all the pulmonary arteries, all the pulmonary veins, and reconnect anastomosis. Anastomosis is sewing them back together one by one between the donor and the recipient arteries and veins. That's a lot. That's 8, 4 on the right lung, 4 on the left lung. That's 8 anastomosis that have to be done. Whereas if we keep the heart and the lungs of the cadaver of the donor together, we only need to disconnect 2, or actually 3, the aorta and the 2 vena cava, all right, from the vein, from the venous circulation. So it's only 3 cuts, and they are huge veins and arteries compared to the pulmonary ones. Like, I understand that, for example, for the artery, the diameter is about the size of a dime. Correct me, cardiologists, if I'm wrong, but it's about a dime, no? The size of the artery, of the aorta. So that's much easier to work with than the pulmonary arteries and veins, which are much smaller by comparison. So it's actually an easier surgery to keep the heart and lungs together as a package, right? All right, so then the CF patient is getting new heart and lung, but the CF heart is good, which has to be excised, right? So that good heart may be a heart donation to a second patient, a transplant patient, right? Like, for example, the case, it was not the case of my friend who needed a new heart, but that would free up a heart that is actually a living heart that is being donated, and the lifespan is greater, because once the body dies, once a person dies, necrosis begins to set in to the organs within minutes, and it will take hours, days even, right? But each organ will start a process of necrosis, of starting to die. The tissue starts to degenerate. There's no more circulation. There's no more oxygen going to those organs or nutrients, etc. Right? And so cadaveric organs in general have a shorter lifespan than living organs in donation. And at least from kidneys, I know it's pretty significant, because a living kidney is about has double the lifespan, an average of about 15 years, as opposed to about 7 or 8 years for a cadaveric kidney, right? So that makes a big difference on the part of the recipient, on the patient, on the transplantation, to get either a living kidney or a cadaveric kidney or organ in general, because generally it has longer lifespan and better rate of success and so forth. These organs, when they're transplanted, they need to kick in right away and start functioning, and that's the crucial moment right there. So on average, it's better, the chances, prognosis is much better with living vital organs. Okay? So it's one case, it's very interesting, where a living heart that is functioning and healthy may be donated, and the donor, who is also the recipient of the whole package, can live. Amazing. Okay, so in fact, there's one case there, that's where I found it. It's from Stanford in 2016. The other one, it's even more creative with kidneys, since kidneys may be donated from living donors, right? This domino transplant has gotten really creative. And at least a couple of years ago, which was when I researched this last, there was a domino transplant of kidneys that involved 60 people. There were 30 donors and 30 recipients. It was amazing, insane. Let's go through it and all the matching that needs to be done. Here's the website where you can see the case described. But basically, it involved 60 patients, right? 30 donors, obviously, 30 recipients. Many of these people did not know each other, and that's the domino thing. It was nationwide. It involved 17 hospitals in 11 states, and it took about 4 months to do it all, even though they were set sequentially and they kept on moving, right? Time is of essence, but time is of essence, not so much for the surgery itself, but why do you think that time is of essence? And you want to keep this domino moving and rolling so that nobody backs out, especially on the donor side, because if the donor side, if a donor backs out, then the whole thing could collapse, right? Let's say halfway or 1/3 into the way. Let's say that these are donor recipient pairs, right? So you can think of donor recipient pairs from 1 to 30. So you can think 30A, 1A, 1B, 2A to B. Let's say the A is the donor, the B is the recipient, and you can go down the line and make 30 A's and B's, right? So the first donor pair, so 1A is matched with 2B, and 2A is matched with 3B, and so on down the line. Then at some point, 1B needs to get a kidney also to be in the sequence, right? Because their donor has already donated to somebody else. Somewhere down the line, if one of the donors pulls out, because they will say, well, my recipient, in other words, my transplant fellow, right, loved one already got their kidney, so I'm pulling out. I'm not donating my kidney anymore because my friend or my family member, my spouse already got their kidney. So I'm out. And they cannot be forced to donate, right? We're not going to strap them down and take out the kidney against their will. They agree and even sign papers and go through all the trial and all that, all the, sorry, not the trial, but the clearance that has to be done. But it's still on a voluntary basis. So until the surgery is done, they can refuse, right? Last minute. So that's the reason for keeping it moving so that no one, last minute decides to, or over a period of time, decides, well, no, we're living now a normal life, and my friend already or my family member already got the kidney, so we're out of here. And even so, it took 4 months to do all this. Anyway, and in fact, at one point, I think that one of the donors in this chain was having second thoughts, okay, because not everyone has the same value systems and motivation and so on and so forth. Some people are a little more queasy about the operation. Being a donor, obviously the donor has to be healthy, so why compromise their health and their life? And they're going to be without a kidney for the rest of their lives and so forth. So they were having second thoughts. But thanks be to God, they were able to be convinced to keep on going, even though their recipient had already received the kidney. Okay, so it did happen along the way, but they were able to complete it. And apparently, this is kind of the record. But the beautiful thing that it's proof of principle that it can be done. Right? So there it is. Anyway, you can read a little bit more about it, but it started, like it says here, it's a gym or a yoga class or something, just friends talking, that in the talk, this one guy says, I have a loved one who needs a kidney, and I'm not a match, for example, I would be willing to donate, but I'm not a match. Do you know someone who would be interested in donating? That got the other guy thinking, of course, they're yoga, so they're healthy and so forth. And that's how it all started. But 4 months later, it was done. All these 60 people, eventually, 30 of them, the 30 donors ended up with 1 kidney. And the 30 recipients actually ended up with 3 kidneys, 2 that were non-functional, which they don't take out because why do extra surgery? They're in there, they're part of the recipient, right? They're part of the patient, a transplant patient, but they're degenerate, they're not working well, leave them alone. And they add the 3rd kidney, which is actually put a little lower in the abdomen, not at the same place, because our kidneys are way up here, just at the end of the rib cage. So it's interesting how no, it's which one, the new one or the old?
The one that is sick.
The old ones?
Yeah,
No.
The one that is sick, the one that doesn't work.
The sick, the degenerate kidneys, the ones that are on kidney failure, right? No, they're just there unless they have cancer or something like that. Then, but I think that the cancer patients do not qualify for transplant. Am I right or wrong? Do they?
I mean, you can develop a complication from your native kidney later on, just like anybody else. You could get a kidney stone, or you could get a
I see.
infection.
Right.
Usually what happens is their profit non-functional.
Right.
The circulation is very low. So their ability to impact the rest of the body
is minimal. And they will continue to degenerate, I guess, gradually.
And they're also at a limited. So it's not like you're transplanting kidney and then this person live.
Yeah, a normal full lifespan of the average of 80 years of age. I see. Right. Yeah, the age factor.
Component, which I don't know the answer to, is that as you develop progressive renal insufficiency, you do have that circulation, and the hormonal activity of the native kidney is still sustained. And we're finding a lot more how the native kidneys can influence hypertension.
Mhm.
And I know some of these recipients who develop hypertension and cardiovascular disease. It's a chicken and egg thing,
Mhm.
but it would be interesting to see.
Right, yes, of course, because at the end of the day, it's an extra organ, right? It is a
Right.
vital organ, but it is an extra organ, so it's gonna have some negative effect in the body,
That also happens in children, because I have a nephew
yeah?
who, when he was born, one of his kidneys were not working.
Uh-huh,
And I think at the end, he only has one working.
yeah, okay,
The other one stayed there.
yeah, the other one's there, as long as it's not causing any harm to the body, right? But like Dr. Martinez says, that kidney, that necrotic kidney can also develop its own problems and diseases, and then that could be a problem.
And this is not my study, but I do believe there's one condition. We have hereditary polycystic kidney,
Uh-huh,
which causes renal insufficiency.
yeah,
But those kidneys tend to develop a lot of complications and malignancies.
mhm,
The tendency is to remove them anyway, so I do believe they are.
I see, okay. Polycystic, meaning that they develop cysts inside, they develop like,
Persist in the kidneys.
mhm, right,
But
yes.
these are hereditary polycystic kidneys, basically full of cysts.
Mhm. Too much, right? Okay. Moving forward then, we're still kind of looking at the biology and the clinical situation of it. As I mentioned, the simplest case for domino is what is known as paired exchange. It involves 4 people in total, 2 donors, 2 recipients. Originally, they don't know each other. In fact, many times it's actually kept anonymous. The pairs, for confidentiality, for HIPAA Act, many things, but also so that there are no conflicts of interest coming through at some point, you know, either fiscal or in kind of asking favors and stuff like that from each other. So the ethics is delicate there, and the best is to keep them anonymous. Okay. Like I mentioned, the 4 surgeries are done simultaneously. So basically you need a hospital that can handle 4 surgical theaters going on simultaneously with this, where 2 kidney extractions are done, and then the 2 transplants are done also at the same time. All right. The match is kept anonymous. And well, later when we get more and more into the bioethics of it, there's talk about monetary compensation for these donations in the United States. It's still illegal, and frankly, I think also it's unethical. But we'll talk about this a little more in detail once we're more knowledgeable about the whole scenario. All right, so this exchange programs, they're anonymous, and there are these registries. So let's talk about these registries for a moment. In the United States, actually, up until the 1980s, this was not regulated much, and it was state by state or even clinical system or hospital system by hospital system. Not every hospital has a transplant unit or a transplant center, all right? We do, it's the one at Jackson, as far as I know. I don't know if there's any other in Dade County that are also doing transplants.
We live in Dade County North.
In Broward?
West.
Oh, Western, okay,
Yeah,
the Cleveland? Yeah, Cleveland, yes, okay, Cleveland Clinic in Broward County. For us, the Jackson Memorial, which is the county hospital, right? Typically, they're large hospitals that have all kind of a support system that have the transplant units, departments. All right, so up until the 80s, this really wasn't regulated at the national level. So there was a lot of inconsistency from state to state and even county to county, or also hospital systems throughout the US. And so there was a need to address this at the national level. and this involved an act of Congress, which is known as the NOTA, or the National Organ Transplantation Act. All right, typically it's the acronym of the first letters, National Organ Transplantation Act in 1984. And this NOTA, this act of Congress, in fact, sets up two federal agencies that handle the whole process and manage it, right? One agency is on behalf of the donor, and the other agency is on behalf of the recipient. They advocate for either one. So on the part of the recipient, in other words, the transplant patient, the patient who is waiting for a vital organ, or it could be a tissue also. This is called the Organ Procurement Transplantation Network, or also known as OPTN, Organ Procurement Transplantation Network. And this is the agency that receives the organ, but I put it in quotations because they don't physically receive the organ, in a package, in a cooler with ice, which is typically the way they are physically transported just in regular ice, not dry ice, but regular ice in a cooler, right? This agency doesn't really physically receive the organ. What they receive is precisely like the PRA score, or the whole, the panel of the patient with regards to the match, right? So they have the registry, which is online. It's a digital registry. It's a digital data bank of the profile, of the clinical profile of the patient waiting for the organ. And that's what needs to be matched. Okay, so today all that is digitalized with the proper clinical terminology and everything else. On the donor side, there is what is known as UNOS, which is United Network for Organ Sharing, right? United Network for Organ Sharing, known as UNOS, and they are the ones who do the allocation. So this UNOS is the one on behalf of the donor. This is the agency that receives the information, the clinical information of the donor, and they put it in the clinical terminology that is compatible with the OPTN data bank, right? And then they run the matches and see where the matches are. The big advantage of this, as you can see, is that by doing it nationwide, matches could be found between donor and recipient across the 50 states. Okay, so obviously there's a great advantage to this by having all this digitalized in the data bank with clinical terminology that is compatible. Okay. And then there are criteria that apply on either side, on the side of the donor and on the side of the recipient. Okay, so that criteria, one of which, for example, is the clearance on the part of the donor. The donor has to have health clearance, including mental health for donating. I'm talking about living donor. There are criteria that apply also for the cadaveric. The obvious one, of course, is consent across the board, right? Consent. So that consent can either be a personal consent or proxy consent. And also, again, I want to point out that in the US, because these lists of transplant patients are long waiting lists, you can get online and see how long they are. When there's a target donation from a donor, it bypasses the list. Okay? In Europe, they don't. In other countries, the targeted donor can donate, to their intended recipient, but it doesn't bypass the waiting list necessarily. It helps a little bit because it moves the list along, right? But typically this is with socialized medicine because it's more public health oriented and so forth. So they see bypassing the list as benefiting an individual patient as opposed to public health. So everyone else on the list they benefit somewhat, at least those who were downstream of the list of the recipient, but not everyone benefits necessarily. So I know that at least in European countries, a target donation does not exempt the recipient from being on the list. They still have to wait. So if there's a match above the recipient, the donor will have to donate to that match wherever it is. Okay. It does move the list forward a little bit, but it's a different concept of the practice of medicine, much more emphasis on the public health side.
So which is
Yep.
better?
Well, which is better? It's an open question, right? It's an open question. That will segue into one of the topics, actually one of the last topics on the first part of the lecture, which is opt-in or opt-out. Opt-in or opt-out medicine, right? Should we harvest automatically, just to prep you a little bit, should we automatically harvest the vital organs of cadavers since they're dead and they don't need them in the grave and they're being wasted, healthy organs from cadavers, should we harvest, should we assume that these cadavers would want it to donate because maybe the question was raised in time or not? So that's what's called opt-in or opt-out. Okay, should we have forms to opt in or to opt out? We'll get there. It's an open question. All right, so let me see. Yeah, all right, here I'm going to focus then kind of like a case study on living organ. And but before I do that, I'm going to flip this around actually. And talk about some of the bioethical issues, then we'll take a break and come back to the case study of living organ transplant. So some of the bioethical issues that come up, we've covered already, others are arising right now with the lecture, but basically the very first one, of course, is the determination of death, especially for cadaveric donors, right? And what is the issue here? What is necessary or highlighted or of great use with regards to the determination of the death is precisely brain death, the neurological criteria. But I emphasize that it should be total brain death, not partial. You see the temptation of going with partial brain death because you still have a beating heart and a circulatory system and a respiratory system with partial brain death, right? Which excludes the brain stem, which controls the autonomic system. But thanks be to God, when that criterion was being established, remember the Uniform Death Act, thanks be to God, both the AMA and the one on the legal, what's it called, the ABA, the American Bar Association, both chimed in favor of total brain death and not partial. And you can think these are two very diverse bodies of people, of professionals. They don't necessarily all have the same value system that we have and so forth. So I'm very happy really that they both chimed in that way, because the AMA was looking at it from the clinical perspective, of course, as medical doctors, and the ABA was looking at it from the legal perspective. But thanks be to God, it did match with our religious perspective or ethical perspective that it should be total brain death. Okay. So, okay, that's enough about that. We went through it in detail at the other course. Also, we talked about informed consent, of course, and it can be either personal informed consent, particularly with living donors, or proxy consent if the deceased donor or the deceased had not specified either in their license or even just by word of mouth or somewhere else in the documentation, then the proxy is the one who may consent, right? The whole issue of payment. Yep.
You have a patient that has that in the license. They don't need any approval from anybody.
That's it.
Right?
Yes.
It's already
It's in the license, yes. What I don't know is, let's say that it isn't licensed. Let's look at a case scenario like that because I really don't know. A patient who comes into the ER, they're declared brain death, they have it on their license, but what if their next of kin doesn't want to go ahead with the donation? I don't know if that holds or not. Or the transplant team has to stay away, or if they can go ahead and procure if they have it on their driver's license. I honestly don't know the answer. Any of you know what plays in there?
I don't know for sure. What tends to happen is create a conundrum.
Yes,
Because it does happen.
right,
Let's say I have on my license, I want to be a donor.
right,
And I've had that since I was 19. And then I get married when I'm 40, the second time. And my new wife has no clue that I want to be a donor.
and I forgot to mention it.
and she's against donation.
Right.
She can object
Mhm.
to the organ donation, and chances are, because this is the little quirk about this whole thing, chances are they will not harvest.
Yeah.
Because actually, the non-altruistic component for this is that the hospitals are reimbursed for donation.
I see.
For harvesting, I'm sorry.
For harvesting.
For harvesting, obviously for the implant also.
Yes,
Uh,
right.
So
Hmm.
the hospitals kind of walk a fine line,
Mhm.
because although the rest of the process is altruistic, quote
Right,
unquote,
right,
they have a monetary incentive to perform these harvesting.
right. Yes,
And so that's created some problems that you could run into where the hospital may be overly aggressive looking for
Mhm.
the
That reimbursement, yes.
the reimbursement.
Right. So playing that scenario forward a little bit, and thank you very much. It could also possibly create legal exposure for the clinic or the system, right? And so out of prudence, I would say, and even so not to be exposed, because let's say if it's a lawsuit, even if they settle out of court, because it's so expensive to go to court, they will still have to settle out of court, and it will typically cost them, because the whole issue of the deep pockets, right? These hospital systems are seen, and in fact are deep pockets because their annual budgets are in the millions at least, right? And then the individual second spouse is it's the David and Goliath perception, right? And you're always going to find a lawyer who's going to do that.
Because in essence, in this, at least the state by state,
Yep.
everything, but in the United States.
Mhm.
In the state of Florida, your spouse is considered always your next of kin.
The next of
Now,
kin
if
and
it's
proxy,
your-
I
yes,
guess.
it's your cousin, your second brother.
I see.
then
It's a little
it
more
becomes
removed,
your spouse,
the spouse specific.
then there's
Yeah.
an issue.
Mhm.
But I have a question. If it
Yeah.
doesn't act as a, you have regarding the license, that wish that you have before.
Right.
It's your own wish.
Yeah,
You know,
Here's a scenario. Let's say, I am getting a monthly pension
Mhm.
from my husband,
Mhm.
and that pension stops once my husband is dead,
Mhm.
right? My husband will not be declared dead until the organ is harvested. I'm talking about a vital.
Yeah.
nobody says pregnant. It's pregnant.
No, but that
Totally.
brain dead is something you have to convince the spouse of, you've been there. That is, right? So if clinically, yes, clinically, this person can be dead,
Mhm.
right? And then
Declared dead, right,
they'll-
clinical.
They'll cite that,
Mm.
right? And they'll say, no. Keep it alive, keep it there, you know, keep them in a nursing home, you know, I've read a story where people will go back 2 years, all that stuff
Right.
goes on.
Right.
So it's not an easy process.
Mhm.
It can be, I mean, it can be one thing, but this is what I'm saying, it's easier if the husband sat there and said, look, I'm an organ donor, they're gonna take out my
Yeah.
eyes, they're gonna take out my,
Right. Mhm.
the ones that I've actually seen work easier
Mm.
have been mothers to their children.
Mm.
Issues.
They are much more understanding
Mhm,
of the beneficence of the act.
mhm. You mean the children cadaveric
The cadaveric, the donor, the children would be donors.
donors? Yes, right.
And
Okay.
when I'm saying children, they could be 25.
Yeah, even adult children. There's children, but even adult children. Yeah, I'm thinking of another scenario that you mentioned, possibly even if it's on the license, that that second spouse would say, oh, yes, it's in the license, but we had a conversation about this afterwards. And he or she told me, the deceased, that they didn't want to donate, but they never bothered to rescind it from the driver's license agency. And that word has to count, even if it's just a word.
That's what I'm getting at, so it can get complicated.
Exactly.
What happens
Yeah.
is the hospital will harvest
Mm,
and then provide that organ to the agency.
right.
And by the way, these agencies are local, subcontracted to the major agency.
Mm,
So
I
they
see.
have, they have.
okay, so there are subcontracts then?
They have a management,
Ah, okay.
so they'll provide it to these agencies,
Uh-huh.
and then these agencies will work for the system.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Now, someplace like Jackson,
Mhm,
they may have 1, 2, they may
mhm.
have, I'm waiting for somebody right here.
Right,
And I got somebody right here,
right,
because.
and another wing of the hospital,
Right,
the same
the
hospital,
recipient was enormous at Jackson,
right.
so once they get the match,
Mhm,
they'll go through their list first, because
Uh-huh.
it's driven first by proximity.
I see, okay, so that takes priority, so
Right,
yeah,
takes priority, so
Uh-huh.
there's a great.
a ranking,
Right,
yes.
depending on how sick you are and so on.
Right, yes,
But if you're very high priority value is how proximate you are. So there may
Right.
be somebody who may be sicker in Georgia,
but
but if you're at Jackson, they'll give it to.
that gives it priority, yes, yeah, yeah. Mhm. Christina,
Yes, I'm gonna be, no, I can't be coming, so Zoom, I don't think we talk about this, but. Why? Well, I would say that maybe ignorance and not knowledge is the main reason why people don't want to do
right,
organ donors.
yes,
So I think that it's something that needs to be more explained. and-
Exactly.
and more information, because at the end of the day, it will become us.
right,
So. well,
Yes.
A lot of people, when you talk about this, they think.
Mhm.
Go to the altar, we know we don't have it, we don't-
right. Exactly, but who cares, right, if we're in the grave already? Exactly, a lot of it is ignorance, just simple plain ignorance, which is a lot of the problems that we have in the world throughout, for any issue, okay? But ever since the 80s and even more into the 90s and so forth, the church has been speaking about this, because I know that ethically, this was an issue originally for the church, right? Because especially for the living, it's a mutilation of a healthy body, of a healthy organ. So how can one justify the mutilation of that body of the donor, even for a recipient who is sick? And so it was an ethical issue until the shift happened with looking at it instead of structurally, functionally, looking at the functionality of the organ rather than structure. And that's where I say that, at least for heart, kidney, and heart and kidney, kidney and kidney, lung, and liver, since those organs can function partially, right? Then the argument was shifted to functionality. All right. But yes, back to your issue, it actually talks about this of opt-in and opt-out. I have it at the very end, because I want to break at that moment, right? So let's hold that thought for a moment. Altruistic versus payment for the organs. I know that it sounds kind of revolting for us to pay or to traffic in these organs, right? But this is a real issue up to today, especially in other parts of the world and in general in the Southern Hemisphere. India, for example, is seriously considering this at the government level, at the federal level. If people have a right to sell specifically their kidneys, which is the most common one that is needed and the one that we can live without easily. It's my organ, why should the state or anyone else prevent me from selling it? It's a touchy thing, but it lends itself to exploitation. kind of parallel to the surrogate motherhood on the third world, right? Rent a womb, as they say, a rent a womb mom. That for 9 months, I'll gestate this child and then give the child to the couple who is paying for it all. So there is kind of an intuition. I don't know. Well, let me shut up and get your feeling about this or get your feedback. What do you think? Should we allow people to buy and sell their organs? And why not?
I mean,
Or maybe,
I mean, this is a personal body. I mean,
right? So do we,
obviously, we don't obviously speak right or wrong. We should.
right? Well, if we shouldn't, we shouldn't, right?
But that would be industry, and that's no wrong.
Well, I mean, it's not, that's why I say we speak right or wrong, obviously it's wrong, but I mean,
Right,
you don't know how people's situations are.
right. And many people that are drastically poor and in need, they have very,
Oh, they do it with blood too, right? I mean,
Right, yeah.
people sell their blood.
well, here it's illegal to sell it. In the United States, it's illegal. It's a donation, but we do get in kind. We get a movie ticket or something, you know, is that considered a payment?
But they have, both man, so they pay for.
They do?
They, 100%.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, okay,
Biotech.
yes,
It was in Broward.
in Broward.
They
were-
every time they donated the blood, but the plasma.
I heard that.
Yeah, or they were for plasma.
They paid 100%.
100. Wow, okay, well, I can go back to my own experience.
They were paying
Right,
at the front.
yeah. $100 cash for plasma.
That people sell their blood for.
Okay. What's that?
Yeah, and that's kind of part of the problem. If you create that scenario, if we lived in a perfect society, all good things would be done.
Right,
But in our society, there is a tendency, and I would say world society, I'm not saying.
right.
here,
Human nature.
Human nature.
Weakened human
To
nature.
exploit. And you could almost see how you would create a caste for donation by suppressing them socially to the point that their function would just be donate your organ at one point or another if you want sustenance and survival.
Right.
So
Forward.
that's very structured in the Indian mentality where they have very much of a caste
Caste,
mindset. So
right.
for them, it would like, yeah, sure.
It
you're
fits
nothing
in,
yet,
especially,
you're not a
right.
Harry up in the mountain yet, you're not wearing orange, you're just whatever.
Yes.
One step away from
The
God.
untouchables.
So sure, yeah, go ahead and donate your thing for survival.
Mhm.
That's, I think that's where it comes to our Catholic belief of the intrinsic dignity of each human person.
Right,
And where we start skewing away from that perspective that for whatever reason, by position monetarily or by my ability to coerce power, I am superior to another person.
yeah. Exactly. Now, we know that, as you can see here, the list gets tougher and tougher, right? But it does lend itself to that issue. It's something that Antonio brought up. Why not? If it's my organ at the end of the day, it's mine. Yes. So this raises a further question in my mind, maybe a little more philosophical. Am I the owner of my body or am I the steward of my body? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Even the father too, I have a point too. Even, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please, Father. Yes.
Yes, the same thing that selling it to the same way that you sell it is my body. I can do whatever I want with it. And more than that too, we see that when it is legally you can sell it, that will be a biggest problem for the third world country.
Third world country, yes, correct, because they would be most exploited.
Exactly. So that, okay, it is legally, we can do it when we are going under the difficult situation, the poverty, so we can use what we should not do, our own body, and to sell to get whatever, that will create a more problem.
Exactly, yes. Yes, absolutely. Another parallel case that comes to mind, to try to find other settings with the same principles. It could also justify, for example, prostitution, because it's my body anyway, and if I want to or need to make money out of it, then I essentially rent my body, right? And so it would, and in fact, some countries have legalized prostitution. It's so prevalent, and that's to try to give the government some kind of a health to try to regulate it. Then if they make it legal, then they need to have a license for prostitution, and they need to have health checkups and so forth. But it's really kind of drastic, right?
And abortion and all that.
Yeah, one other. So I live in Rabbit Hole.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
even in, let's say you did that in this country. So who would then be responsible post your donation for anything that happens after your donation?
And because of the donation, no?
And because, not even, because of that, so I give a part of my liver and then all of a sudden I feel weak and I'm anemic and I don't process the same food, or I say I get diarrhea, whatever it is, and I can't work anymore. Does the state allow you to become disabled because you donated, although you profited from the liver transplant?
Interesting. Another angle, right? That it's even
So
more.
then what's the?
Becomes if it's state sponsored or state allowed, then the state has to then pay for the disability of that person lifelong.
I'm sorry, because I'm not trying to understand. So what you're saying, Dr. Martinez, is if you do it altruistic, then you go through the hospital system and you do the donation, then the hospital is responsible and to make sure that you continue, that your health will continue, okay, or no? So you donate, you go and nobody's worried about you anymore.
Okay,
And in the case of the one that pays, then that organization, whichever it is responsible? Or neither?
Nobody.
That's what
No.
I'm saying. So at the end of the day,
There
there's
is.
no benefit in either getting payment or not, because the consequences are the same.
You don't have
Well-
any complication, you don't have.
right, right. But you see, we have to, I think that here we have to go country by country at least, because of the whole ethos of the country, right? The cultural ethics, but also the insurance issue. Because somebody has to pay. I mean, these operations are minimally tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Why people don't do it.
So, yeah, no, but on the, and I can speak a little more personally about this, but on the part of the donor is for free. But somebody's paying, and typically it's the insurance or the system that is charging. Do they charge their insurance, or who is paying on behalf of the donor?
They will charge whatever government agency is gonna.
The government agents. So
So
the
they
government.
participate in the transplant program,
Mhm,
and then I forgot which building component it is.
uh-huh,
But they'll bill for the organ transplant, they won't bill your insurance
okay.
as a donor.
On the donor, but the recipient typically is insurance, no?
The harvesting.
Yes,
They bill the
right.
harvesting.
Uh-huh,
And
okay.
then on the recipient, yes, they'll bill insurance.
On your back.
So when
Yeah,
they
right.
do the transplant, it's therapeutic,
Mm-hmm,
so that they will bill your insurance.
mm-hmm, right,
So your insurance
that's the
will have
patient,
different components of reimbursement. So
right,
for example, Medicare
uh-huh,
only has certain transplant centers.
mm-hmm,
So you
I
can't
see,
just.
that are qualified.
Right, that are qualified because of
Mhm.
outcomes, costs and so on.
Sure,
So if you wanted to get a transplant in Florida, it wasn't until recently that Jackson, they still are not 100% sure. When I was there, we weren't,
mm,
were able to do Medicare cardiac transplant.
I
So
see.
Jackson
Mhm.
was not doing
And that's for
Medicare.
cardiac specifically,
right,
yeah, you
so
have
if
to
you
go
wanted
organ
to
by
have
organ.
the-
Okay. Mm-hmm,
Now, the insurances have
Mhm.
developed their own transplant center.
mm-hmm,
Because it's again, it's more.
it's more cost
appropriate
effective.
and Cost effective
Mhm.
for me to have, like, I can have my transplant done at whatever Broward General or Gainesville or wherever it is,
Mhm.
versus everyone who has Humana who flies to Texas to
Mhm.
have their transplant done.
Right, centralized and.
centralized and then the cost
They save.
is contained because you pay a fee, you say.
Exactly.
I'm gonna pay $100,000 for a transplant,
Right.
and that's it. If it costs you
Mhm.
more, it costs you more.
Yes,
So that's one of the component, but it's on the therapeutic, which is implant. The harvesting is paid through the agencies.
Right, okay.
And your donation, I don't know if the donation is billed or taken as cost. Because I'm not sure.
I see,
That I know, but I know that the when they do the procedure,
right.
the hospital bills.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it's a combination between the government and the insurance industry.
But you said something,
Yeah.
you have to take this country by country.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
different health systems throughout the world.
Right.
have to approach it.
Again, even Europe, right, with the socialized medicine, it's going to be very different system. In general, I would think that the government is more involved in it and we have to pay more and so forth. More bureaucracy.
But at the end of the day.
Yeah.
This is all about money. Because it's.
No, it's not. Why is it all about money? Yeah, okay.
The first, what I'm trying to say is,
Uh-huh.
I understand all the, and I could see the ethical implication and all this,
Mm.
but. It was until, I don't know, because I don't know, I'm
Right.
not knowledgeable enough to know.
Yeah.
When this became acceptable,
Yeah.
because yes, it helps people to continue living.
Mm.
My husband is a recipient of our, what's it, válvula de la
Aortic valve.
valve,
Yeah.
transplant.
Well,
Um, it was done in Texas, by
Mhm.
Dr. Lamela, because he was a live or dead, and he needed to be
wow.
going there because he was the only one that can do the surgery. That's what UN said, so we went there. And he had a pig, so.
Oh, it was a pig valve?
Pig or cow, I think it's a combination. of both.
Yeah.
Go buy it.
Yeah,
It's out.
something like that, but. We didn't pay any money because Enrique's insurance was cover everything. But
Yeah, good insurance.
very good, I don't have the same insurance. So it's
Yeah.
Point is somebody, because doctors have to be getting paid, the hospitals have
Right.
to get
Oh, yeah.
paid.
Yeah.
This is not a, you cannot do this in grass, you know, like, let's do this here.
Right.
There's a lot, so it costs a lot of money, so somehow, of course, the. How do I say, promoting organ transplant
Mhm.
at the end of the day might be because of money.
I'll give you an alternative thought. It certainly involves money, but what doesn't involve money, right? Especially at least where we live, which is the Northwestern Hemisphere and more specifically in the United States. To me, it's more about what is the standard of care for that nation? What is the standard of care? You know, are we at the point that because this is feasible and my bad is that I didn't really do a history of transplantation, but going back just a few decades, transplants were very improbable to be successful. And when they were started, the patients would die sometimes within months or maybe short years. So it's really a whole big effort for little return on the investment, if you will. But now this whole industry, if you will, this whole scenario has gotten so sophisticated that we're getting better and better outcomes for the patients, right? And they live years and decades after the transplantation of vital organs. So we're to the point where we can say, well, we can do this. We can do this, right? Technologically. So the standard of care is that, and now we look at the infrastructure. In other words, does the infrastructure as a whole, society as a whole, can it support this with the insurance system that we have, of a market economy, et cetera, with the billing ability of hospital systems, so on and so forth, right? And the taxes that we pay that go into healthcare. So standard of care, right? Not every country has this kind of standard of care that we have here.
2 cases. One case, it was in Jackson Memorial, it was about like, it was waiting for a living trust. but he was in the last stage. But suddenly a liver transplant appeared and he had the surgery. Then what happened is he gets complicated 3 or 4 days after because of kidney problems, so they have to do a kidney transplant. The guy now, he couldn't walk, now he dances a little. On the other hand, I have a patient that is in hospice. He has a kidney problem, and stage kidney disease because of diabetes, hypertension, all this. He's a veteran from Vietnam where he goes 3 times a week to do dialysis.
Right.
It's getting worse and worse and worse. He's in the list transplant, but he hasn't got it. He's here, alertament times 3. He needs to use oxygen all the time because it's getting all complicated and complicated. If that guy had a transplant, his life would be very different. No. But
This
it's
is a great thing.
actually because it made changes in the life. But the topic, the point that you are pointing was about when the patient, any person dies, those organs would get to the garbage because it's true.
Right.
Very sad.
If they are not in the list of transplant, it would be
Yeah.
excellent. You know, you said that you have 100,000 people waiting for a transplant.
For kidney, 100,000 approximately.
For kidney, just kidney.
Yeah.
Imagine if those organs, they go to the improvement
Right.
of those organs, how many people would get benefit from it?
Mhm.
You know, if there would be a lot.
Right,
you
yeah.
know?
That feeds into the opt-in and opt-out. But before we get there, we need to go through transplantation tourism and this because, yeah, but you see the bioethical issues come up.
They look very nice, you know, because I didn't know about.
Exposition.
See,
Right,
and
the background. The complicated detailed background, there's always a devil in the detail. Right.
When you read the sentence,
Yes,
we just went. boom.
right, gonna save the life of the patient.
She died 2 years ago, but she, for like 20 years.
Yes,
She had a
liver transplant.
and she was like that at Jackson. She didn't have
Already.
insurance. She was one of my coworkers in driving class.
Oh,
And all of a sudden that night, Father Federico was there, gave her the last rites.
yes,
And in the middle of the night, a donor appeared.
She got a
at the
call.
latch,
Yep.
And it was somebody who was in jail.
I know the case.
And she was in this
They
debate
refused.
whether, no,
No,
she didn't at the
Was she?
end. She received it.
seriously.
You have all the, you know, so she got it.
Uh-huh.
And she lived 20 years.
20 years.
Perfect condition.
Okay. Hold the thought of the jail prison thing because we're gonna go there in a minute. But Antonio, you had another question or comment?
If we, so in order for the donor, we got a license, so when we, obviously we die, we go to the bomb, you know, like the people that go mortuary, so you tell me if our name isn't, like, if they don't say donor on the license, they just throw our organ.
Yeah, it stays with the body and goes into the grave. Right, so they don't harvest the organs unless we specifically say it.
But now we learned that we need to put it also in a living will. And be more.
Right,
Because.
more proactive about it and tell your family and friends, so it's a common knowledge. The license is not enough. Right. I want to pick up on something you said earlier, Antonio, because I think you were pointing out to something that has to do not only with this course, but actually with the whole program of the Master's in Bioethics, the way I'm teaching it. It's obvious by now that I'm doing principal bioethics in contrast with utilitarian bioethics. So in a utilitarian bioethical system, it could be justified. So the means, the end justifies the means, right? And the end is good, right? Like getting money from my kidney or whatever, or lobe of the liver, then the means are justified, by the end, but not in themselves. So what you raised earlier to me is very clearly an example of the difference, the clear difference between principal bioethics or utilitarian bioethics. The end may be a good end, but the means also need to be the proper means. Like you say, well, it's unethical, but why not? That truly at the end of the day for me would be a utilitarian perspective of how to do this. Yes, is there someone asking? I don't know why that came up. There's no chat. Okay, right. Okay, so very briefly, since the issue of jail or prison came up, there have been reports, and we have seen it in the news, it went back a few years ago, that some countries were actually harvesting organs, vital organs of death row inmates. They were going to die anyway, they were going to be killed by the state, let's say that they did commit a heinous crime or whatever, and so they were death row, but it was done, the harvesting was done involuntarily. So what about consent? There was not necessarily consent. Okay. And I'm speaking specifically of China. And you know what the proof of the pudding was? That at some point, again, this goes back a few years ago, but China actually made a declaration saying, oh no, we're not doing that anymore. What does that mean? That's a admission of guilt. We're not doing that anymore, means that we were doing it, right? And also transplantation tourism, it's amazing, but think about, again, you know, not everyone has the same value system that we have, but they maybe have a lot of money that we don't have, all right? Maybe they're millionaires, and that millionaire needs a kidney. And so they'll go into another country and they'll actually bring in their whole transplant team with them. They will go into a hotel, rent a room for whatever time it takes. They will seal that room, sterilize it, and the transplant team will come in and pick up another person, maybe a homeless or someone else from the street, and pay them whatever thousands of dollars they need for their kidney and do the transplant in the hotel room. It sounds insane, but it has happened. That's what's called transplantation tourism. Sometimes the government actually facilitates and says, you don't need to go to a hotel, you come to our government hospital, and we'll do it here. You just need to pay X number of millions of dollars or whatever for the organ that you need. And then the government will be the agency that will procure that organ. Don't ask any questions how that organ appeared, but it's going to be a vital organ. So you see what Dr. Material was saying, that this is the slippery slope, right? Once you get away from that altruism, essentially anything goes. And it becomes a market, and it's a multi-million-dollar market. Part of human trafficking is for organ procurement. The other part is for slave slavery and all that, and other type of slavery at home. But human trafficking is along this way. And it's happening. And there's a dark web that we should never go to, but it exists and it's there. To the point that even now the federal government will throw baits into the dark web, acting as either a patient or a seller to see who bites in the dark web to catch them. So this is happening.
Basically, so if they take the organ of the homeless, they pay, they don't know who's going to be the donor. I mean,
the recipient.
But they put it in, here we have a kidney, it's ready.
Yeah.
Here is it.
Well, no, they get the recipient first, right? Because that's the person who's paying.
And how do they know this?
No, because he's paying for all the he said that he hired all these.
Yeah.
team
The patient will- Right.
So
The patient will pay and then wait for the match to appear.
that's like an organ that can be donored, but donate. But they also do tests and stuff to see.
They have to for the match, right?
Wow.
They have to.
That's
With the highest rigor of clinical practice, by the way, okay? I mean, it's similar to part of the comparison, but what's happening during the Holocaust at the Nazi concentration camps, the clinical trials that were run were at the highest level of rigor, of clinical rigor, of medical rigor, but they happened to be unethical because there was no consent. You know, electrocuting people to see how much electricity they could withhold was done with the quality, let's say just the clinical quality, the medical quality of those experiments was of the highest quality possible. All right, hypothermia to see how much cold the body could tolerate before freezing to death. But it happened to be highly unethical because you're freezing people to death without their consent, or even with their consent. Shouldn't be done. Mm-hmm.
Many years ago, when Saul had leukemia,
Mm-hmm.
we all went, a lot of us, to the matching.
Right,
with,
there you go. That's for bone marrow, right?
that bone marrow.
Mhm.
So is that what they do? They take her blood and they will,
Yeah, that's the first one there, you know, it's the easiest one also because with a blood sample, basically, they can start with a match system, right? Also, keep in mind that, again, I'm going out of my field here, but immunosuppressants have become more and more sophisticated so that now they can custom tailor that to the patients more or less so that they're able to suppress that immune system to tolerate a match that is a looser match, let's say. I'm not using the proper clinical terminology, but can anyone chime in on that, on the immunosuppressants, how it's getting better? I don't know.
Again, this is not my field at all.
Right.
But from the perspective of the immunosuppressant, what they've done is they've taken a different approach to immunosuppressants.
Yes.
From global immunosuppression to targeted immunosuppression of the particular cellular immunity that impacts the organs. So they'll change what they call the cocktails, depending on the status of your immune system and where you are in the transplant cycle. The reason I wanted to speak a little bit about it because this transplantation, tourism, and organ trafficking also creates another problem, is that all of these transplants require lifelong monitoring.
Yes.
So if you go to another country and get your transplant, you come to the United States, now all of a sudden, the people in the United States are picking up the cost of maintaining your transplant.
Right.
And that will be covered under your insurance.
Yes, for the
That's
patient.
another kind of
Another angle. Yes.
Thing that happens. Again, to me, if you're doing the right thing, if your motivation is good, maybe hard to define, but if you can get appropriate advice, then things are done appropriately.
Right.
But again, from the immunosuppressant, which is the question, there's different types of immunosuppression now that we use than what we used to have, which was basically some type of mechanism to basically shut down your immune system. Now we can target which the particular cells, so that they even become recognizable as part of human cell presentation, or turning off some particular
factors,
gene, which is the one that may create the reaction.
Wow. Okay, excellent. Yes, you made me think of another issue that I want to point out also. So in general, it's going more personalized and even organ or tissue specific, right? With the immune system. And I just thought of something else that is done that is really creative for specifically for kidney, maybe done for liver also, and maybe lungs. What they do is before the transplant itself, let's say for kidney patients, they will shut down the immune system of the transplant patient, the patient waiting for a kidney. They will shut down the immune system temporarily, put them in the bubble situation, right? And do a bone marrow transplant from the donor. And what the bone marrow transplant does, it starts generating some of the immune cells from the donor that are compatible with the eventual kidney, with the donor kidney. So that kidney is not recognized, at least fully, as a foreign object, because now the bone marrow is producing, the donor bone marrow is producing compatible immunology, right? And then once that patient, the transplant patient has built up its new immune system, his or her immune system with a new marrow, then they go ahead and do the transplant of the kidney or the other organ. Creative. Yeah. So some of those patients may not need immunosuppressants or minimally so, because big advantage. Clinical. Okay, so I mean, we talked about opt-in and opt-out also, but just I'll leave it as an open question and then take a little break and come back to a particular case study. But basically, that's what the opt-in would be this present system that we have. In other words, if you want to donate you have to opt into donation. You have to state it somewhere, right? And hopefully in various places so that at least your immediate friends and family know that one is an organ donor. Opt out is the opposite of that, the total opposite. The assumption in society when a person dies is that they want to donate, that they don't want to waste those organs in the grave, right? And so in order to keep one's organs as a cadaver, one would opt out of transplants. One would opt out of harvesting, of donating. Okay? So this really flips it around. And in Europe, in some countries of Europe, they're beginning to consider this, or they're having it as a national discussion, because it has to be at the national level. Imagine, you know, all the people who die on an average day, thousands, okay? And so the idea would be, all of a sudden, if opt-out kicks in, it would have to kick in nationwide, right? And then all of a sudden you'd have an overabundance of vital organs that in principle would be eligible for harvesting, okay? But it takes a huge amount of education on the part of society to do that. So, you know, in my mind, this could be an option that may be ethical, but it would take a huge education campaign beginning in elementary school, in school children, of the altruism of not taking one's vital organs to the grave, because it's a waste, right? Biologically, it's a waste, and they could save someone else's life. So it would basically promote an altruism throughout society, but it would have to be like a national campaign of education, and then making it available periodically. Remember, if you want to opt out, I think at the opt out, basically, we can set some kind of a standard there. Let's say underage will be under the parents' decision, right? But of age, periodically, they would have to review, okay, here's the form. If you want to opt out, if you want to use it, you know, it's available, make it available across the nation, again, in maybe in colleges or something like that, or workplaces. In other words, it would involve a national discussion, right? And we have to maybe be brought up for a vote, who knows, something like that. But everyone has to be on board. Basically, we would be changing, again, the ethos, which is the cultural ethics of the time. Yeah. But it's an open question. It would certainly wipe out. I'll leave you with this thought, at least for kidney, which I'm more familiar with. Like Dr. Farid mentioned, the list is about 100,000 in the United States, the waiting list, about 100,000 more or less, and about 15 die every day for lack of a kidney, all right, for lack of a donation, about 15. Well, maybe to keep the 100,000, right? Yeah, but you know, people go into renal failure for many reasons all the time.
That brings me a question.
Mhm.
If we know that this kidney is the largest organ transplant that is needed,
Right.
why don't we, the same way we give a campaign to have a healthier kidneys? I mean, I diabetic, so of course my kidneys at one point might not be working.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm just thinking maybe this, why so much kidney disease? That's the question, but I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a public health question, right? Okay, but yeah.
The question is the opt-out conversation in this country. It never happened here.
That I know of, is not really seen well, right, by society in general. And there's that, what do we call that? The yucky factor of having my organs removed after I die, because we really have even the whole issue of death. I mean, who normally talks about death and preparing for death and spiritualizing death and all this? We tend to shun it, even trying to prolong life to the extreme, right? So it's a very difficult conversation to have, and in our society in particular, I think that we're far away from it, frankly. It's just my sense of being here about half a century, about 52 years, growing up in my adult life, basically in the US. Okay, how about we take a little break and then I keep talking about the case study that I want to talk about of living kidney donation, right? Pause here for a moment. Okay, so 11:25. How about we come back at 15 minutes, 11:40? Is that good? All right, so we'll be back at 11:40. Okay, I'm going to resume the lecture here and do the light thing for the board. Right. I'm also noticing, things that I don't notice right away, but afterwards when I see the recording, that when I pause in the recording, of course, live, we know that we're pausing, but the recording is connected end to end. So the record this goes from the end of the previous session to now, it goes right through. So that's what I'm saying now. Resume recording is the second part. All right, so what I want to do is use this case of a living kidney donor, just to set a background a little bit. The scenario I was mentioning that right now, at least in the United States, it's about 100,000 patients on the waiting list for kidney in various stages of renal failure, right? But we know that that is that these are vital organs, and typically these people are on dialysis. The regimen, which is pretty rigorous, if you remember, 3 days on, 3 days off, on and off, 1 day on, and then the next day off, so forth. And typically the day off, they spend recovering from the day that we're on the machine. On dialysis, they can be for anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, more or less, depending on their body mass, because it has to do with a weight issue. Essentially, their blood is taken out of their body, slowly put through the machine, through the dialysis machine to filter out the toxins, which takes a while, and then is put back into the body. And water is also added there because the toxins are taken out in a liquid, in a solution, and that solution is water, right? Part of the plasma. And that's why we know that the kidneys also regulate the pressure, blood pressure, called osmoregulators, and they do that precisely by filtering out more or less water. In other words, the toxins are dissolved in the water, and that's what's taken out, and the output of that, of course, is urine. So that's why every time a patient goes on dialysis, they have to sign a form, a release in case of cardiac arrest, because it plays with their pressure, right? And that's why it's sensitive, and there has to be not only a nurse monitoring the patients in the dialysis center, but also there has to be a nephrologist on call all the time while dialysis is going on, just in case one of the patients has an issue. In other words, it's a pretty rigorous thing and draining physically and psychologically. So certainly it behooves us to look at the issue of kidney donation, living kidney donation, because it happens that of the vital organs is really one of the relatively easy to donate. Now, I knew this ever since I was a biology student at FIU back 50 years ago in the 70s, because I kept hearing it that some organs we can donate live, and the kidneys, because they're paired, what is known as solitary kidney, a single kidney can function in a percentage, anywhere from 60% up, right? Can substitute, and the person can have a normal life, the donor. So at one point, I was living in Philadelphia. It's after I did my second doctorate, after I did genetics at Purdue. I was assigned to a center that is in Philadelphia. It's a National Catholic Bioethics Center, right? And that center does precisely what the title says. We do bioethics at the national level, and we do it from the Catholic perspective. And the acronym is NCBC. So I was assigned to that center as a bioethicist. Let's go to the website for a moment here. So that's the center there, and it has a lot of resources from the Catholic perspective. One of the things that we do at the NCBC every 2 years is to put together a 3-day workshop for the bishops of the United States. For the bishops of the United States, and that's done in Dallas. It's been, we're on the 25th or 26th conference or something like that. It's been going on every 2 years for the past 40 or 50 years. So I've been involved with that, and we're gearing up for one coming up in probably February of next year. It takes 2 years to put this together, basically, but it's kind of consultations that we do. Anyway, I'm still associated with them, but not on a full-time basis, obviously. So I was there right after the doctorate back in 2005 to 2006. Yes, I was living in Philly, assigned to this center full-time. And during that time, there was a parishioner that I knew from the parish of St. Kevin, where I was a pastor before going to Purdue. I was there for about 5 years, met a lot of families. The parish was one of these large parishes in the Southwest that had also an elementary school and everything else. So a lot of young families there that I met. And this one family in particular, the lady was a kidney patient. She had already had 2 transplants and was on the second rejection on dialysis. She had a complicated medical history, was taking care of her elderly mother and young child. So in addition to her own health issues, she had extra responsibilities, taking care of her mother, who was elderly, and taking care of a young child growing up. And because she was already on her second kidney transplant, she would not qualify really for a third transplant. And she was on dialysis and degenerating. So I said, well, why don't I give her a kidney? The thought came, I said, I've been hearing about this all my life, basically all my adult life, being in science, and I know the theory behind it, but what about putting the theory to practice and see what happens? And I kept saying, I'm probably not a match anyway, but so at least I tried, and I could get the feather on my cap that I tried, but I wasn't a match. So that takes me off the hook, right? And I knew because of the friendship that she had done her transplants at Jackson Memorial, precisely here in Miami. Jackson Memorial Hospital, for our folks online, is our county hospital here. Is a very large one. In fact, it services the medical school of the University of Miami, which is a tier 1 university we have here in Miami, private, and they are the medical facility, the teaching hospital. Now there's been also, well, also bought another hospital right across the street, and now has their own hospital, but they're still associated somehow with Jackson. Anyway, it's a large county hospital, and they have the transplant center there. So I knew that she had her transplants there. So while in Philly, I just picked up the phone and made the first call, which was without telling the recipient anything at all, of course, because if we weren't going to be a match, I wasn't even going to raise it. No sense getting the hopes up of a person and then not being a match, everything collapses, right? Just can't do it. So I called the transplant center and I told them such and such a person, a friend of mine had both her transplants there. She's now on renal failure. By the way, the transplant center will follow the recipient for life, at least here in the county. I don't know if it varies from county or from state, but the basically it may have to do with insurance, I don't know, or Medicare, but the recipient, in other words, the patient, the transplant patient, once they get the transplant, they are followed for life on a monthly basis. They have to give a urine sample on a monthly basis, and they follow their chemistry, right, for life, at least here in the county, which is the case that I know of. For the donor, the transplant center will follow you for 1 year. That's it. Let you go. You're on your own. But for 1 year, they figure if you're stable, you're good. Whatever happens beyond that, it's on you. Anyway, I asked them, I'm considering donating a kidney. I consider that I'm basically healthy, but I really don't know unless we do a procedure, right? Would you be willing to start with the basic, which is the blood sample, to see if we're a match at least, and then go from there. And if it's not, it's like an algorithm, right? If there's no match, end of conversation. If there is a match, then we go to the next level, which is to get clearance from my general practitioner, from my primary doctor, and the specialist, at least a urologist, a nephrologist, and also psychologist, because I have to be mentally, they're saying, you want to donate a kidney, you're crazy or something, right? You got to be crazy enough to donate a kidney, and then that checks. But they have very specific questions, which I'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, so Jackson says, yes, fine, we can do it confidentially. So what you need to do is come in and we'll do the blood work. So, well, I happen to be in Philly and I don't have plans for going to Miami anytime soon. Can we do it here? Says, sure, no problem. Just give us your mailing address and we'll send you a package UPS of all the tubes. And by the way, there were seven tubes that had to be filled. It was almost like a blood donation. Not quite a pint, but close to it. And so I said, okay, send me the package and I'll try to do this locally. It happens that I was at a parish. I was in residence at a parish that the pastor there was the chaplain for the Filipino community in the Philadelphia area. Okay, now it happens that Filipinos make very good nurses. I don't know what the deal is exactly, but in the Philippines, if you study nursing, you can come right into the States and practice. It's amazing. Maybe they do the NCLAS or something over there. They must do all the, in other words, it's like, I get the feeling that the nursing schools in the Philippines are certified by US agencies, which is amazing. Mm-hmm.
Well, back in the 80s.
Wow. There you go.
And I can get it.
Oh, yes?
It's not active.
Oh, it's not active anymore. Okay, so we're trying to promote our own nursing. Okay, but so a lot of nurses that are Filipino went through that, who are Filipinos, they went through that program, and they also happen to be Catholics. So that's a happy thing. In fact, I remember it brought me memories from St. Kevin because typically in parishes, we have on a daily basis, we have an early mass and we have a late mass on a daily basis. And the early mass was maybe 6:30 or 7 a.m. We also service a hospital that's nearby, which is, well, it was Kendall Regional then. I don't know if the name has changed now. CMA, Kendall or something. But it was a hospital near the parish that we service. And the Filipino nurses would come to the early mass and then they would go to the morning shift, right? Or if they're coming out of the graveyard shift, the night shift, they would come to the mass before going to sleep or having breakfast. Anyway, nurses, Filipino nurses typically are associated with the parish. So the pastor, Our Lady of Hope there in Philadelphia, he was Filipino himself and he was the chaplain for the Filipino community. And of course, they would have their meetings there and their socials and everything. So I knew some of those Filipino people and some of them were nurses. So I asked one of them if she were willing, if she could do this, right? Just draw the vials for the blood. One Sunday afternoon after Mass, we're going to the rectory, and if she could draw the blood and send it to, and then I'll take care of sending it back. It came with a return address and everything, the package. They're all, so these tubes are heparinized inside, meaning that heparin is an anticoagulant. And she said, sure, Father, no problem. I'll see you after Mass on a particular Sunday. And we went to the rectory right there. She drew the 7 vials and put a little Band-Aid over here. I put them back into the box, not frozen or anything, just regular UPS back overnight. So by Monday, the people at Jackson had my samples, processes, and they said, okay, now give us a couple of weeks to do the chemistry. And in a couple of weeks, I get a call, and sure enough, we're matched. I said, oh no,
Now it's feeling.
you must be mistaken. But then, so I had a meeting with my family to tell them about what I was doing, right? And her family, and at first said, no, absolutely not. I'm not taking your kidney. You're a priest. I don't want a priest kidney. I says, well, I said, let's do this. Call her Maria for protecting the innocent and the guilty. Okay. I said, Maria, you don't have to decide. I mean, put it in prayer. Let it be the Holy Spirit who decides. I mean, after all, I'm still in prayer about this. The fact that I'm a batch doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna get my kidney, because it happens that now I have to go get clearance from my doctors. And I may or may not get clearance, who knows? I mean, my kidneys may not be, or my health, whatever. So I need to get clearance before we go forward. Therefore, it's not a done deal yet, but at least in principle, I'm willing to donate. All right, so put it in prayer and let the Holy Spirit. And then she was on a retreat at a center in Georgia. Is the Holy Spirit retreat house. It's a community, Cistercians. It's a community of monks that do retreats for lay people and so forth. And it happened to be, I remember, because it was the day of Saint Benedict, right? That she got the answer from the Holy Spirit. It says, okay, Father, I'll be willing. I'm going to offer it up, and we'll be willing to take your kidney if you qualify, right? Again, keeping in mind her particular situation, that she was already on dialysis and all this. She also, one more factor is that I mentioned she had a complicated medical history. She had had a stroke about 20 years prior, and she was hemiplegic, meaning kind of paralyzed half of her body. So in addition to all the things that she had to do basically everything with one hand and 1.5 feet to get around. So really, really complicated. And on top of that, to be on dialysis. So I started the procedure over there in my GP was over here, my primary, who had been following me for 30 years now, since I was ordained. I have the same primary doctor, but the urologist and nephrologist, of course, had to be over there in Philadelphia. And it turns out that I was healthy enough to donate, So then came down to Miami, and the last clearance was with the psychologist, right? Who asked me the question, and I was really not expecting this question, because all the time I'm spiritualizing this and I'm saying, well, the science says that I can do it and I should be okay. The doctor said I can do it too. But he says, all right, let's say you go through the procedure and you recover, she recovers. A month or 2 or 3 months later, she goes on renal failure and she loses a kidney. Now she's back to dialysis where she was 3 months ago, and you're without a kidney. Says, what's your reaction to that? And I go, oh no, don't tell me that, give me the kidney back. Yeah, I really wasn't expecting it, but quickly, well, I had to dig into my faith and say, well, doctor, we did what we could do. I did what I could do. And if it's lost, it's lost. What am I going to do? At least I tried. And nothing. I go forward because whether she lives or dies, I will be the same, patient-wise going forward with a solitary kidney. So be it. Let fate be what it is. And they say, okay, you're crazy enough. You qualify. So go ahead. He gave me the clearance. And we went through the procedure. Eventually, the procedure itself was really interesting because then, of course, I need to do further testing. They do a contrast of the kidneys to see which one qualifies better, right, for the transplant. And it's so there's one kidney that is behind the liver and the other one that is not, because the liver is a little displaced. And to do it laparoscopically, meaning with the Da Vinci robot, which is very interesting, like an octopus, that is much more precise and less invasive. Right, just to show you the robot. It's interesting. Yeah, they have 3 to 4 entries, and no, but the actual machine. Well, anyway, it looks like a mechanical octopus with these arms. Let's see if it shows the actual. Oh, it's a little getting right. See, and it's a robot. Okay, but counterintuitively, it's much more precise than the hand of a surgeon. The first thing, of course, because so one tube brings in, for example, a light and a camera. Another tube brings in CO2, which blows up the chamber, and they make a chamber out of the abdominal region so that these tubes can manipulate. Not a large thing, but they fill you with CO2, with gas, right? And then another tube brings in the cutting tools, which could be actually, it's an ultrasound, a high vibration. And at the same time that it cuts, it also cauterizes, it seals. And so there's minimal blood loss within. All right, it's super interesting, the whole modern technology involved. And then all of this, of course, is visualized on a camera. So the surgeon is in another room. Of course, there are also medical personnel here, physically where the thing is occurring, right? But they're just kind of watching, making sure that everything is going okay. But the actual surgeon is in another room with a joystick playing these instruments on a camera. But the first thing that it does on the screen is it magnifies it about 10 times. So it's much easier to navigate in there with these. These are actually micro manipulators, so they can be moved to at least a millimeter, maybe fractions of a millimeter inside the operation scenario. Okay, so it's really much more precise than a doctor. And that's why laparoscopic is preferable to the traditional cut from side to side. All right, but they still do have to make a last cut manually to take out the kidney. So what they have to do is they have to cauterize and seal, cut off the renal arteries and veins and all that to disconnect. And then dislodge the kidney. And the last surgery that is done is actually an incision around the navel, right, semicircular, and so that the other surgeon will stick the hand in physically to retrieve the kidney. Okay, and that one was a female. I remember Dr. Chan, and she's Chinese Jamaican. And the reason why it's a female is because her hand is smaller. So I try to make the smallest incision, but imagine the detail of thought that has gone into this procedure. The smallest hand possible so that the incision around the navel is the smallest possible. And her being just Chinese Jamaican, she was petite. All right, she's going to retrieve it. Actually, it involved three surgeons. One surgeon working on me, the other surgeon working on Maria, the recipient, and then the third surgeon who actually carried the kidney physically from one surgical theater to the other. Adjacent. Sorry? Not the same room, they're adjacent rooms because they're actually different operations. Mine took about 3 or 4 hours, hers took about 12 hours. It was under the knife, and number one, hers was traditional, okay? Secondly, she already had 2 previous kidneys, which were on failure, plus her own 2. So she has 4 kidneys inside, all right? They're all failure. There's a lot of adhesions that have happened in that area. So to prepare the site and to find another area in the abdominal region lower to attach this one was quite a feat. And it took them 12 hours to do all that. First the prep and all that. Okay, so it was pretty demanding. So yes, that went on. And then I was released in 3 days. She took 1 or 2 more days for discharge, right? And her recovery was longer than mine. Obviously, it was gradual. But the first discomfort was pain within the abdominal region and also pain on my back here. Now, they told me a lot of stuff, but they didn't tell me everything. And I couldn't figure out. I'm glad they didn't tell me beforehand, right? But I'm feeling the consequences of this. And particularly, I could understand the pain in my abdomen, even though I didn't really know the real cause. But I figured, well, they worked in there, they took out a kidney and everything else. So there's certainly that area is traumatized. But the pain on my shoulder, I couldn't figure out the back of the shoulder. And it turns out that it's because of the position. It's called a prone position. What they do is, yeah, they put you kind of sideways, but they also tie your arm behind like this. They tie it back there because asleep under anesthesia, the patient could do this, could move their arms unconsciously. And certainly you don't want to hit this machine with an arm, okay? Because that could be major tragedy. And so they tie the arm behind, and that's the pain I kept feeling back here.
It's very strong.
It is, it's a strong tie.
Strong too.
Yes, exactly. But a movement like that is cannot be sustained, right? Okay, so that explained that. But then the abdominal thing is because of the CO2. At the end, they do take out with one of these tubes some of the CO2, but they cannot take out all of it because they get too close to the tissue and they could actually suck out tissue, which they don't want to do, right? Or hurt or cause a hemorrhage in there. And so some CO2 stays within and it has to go parietally through the walls. It has to be reabsorbed by the tissue, by the viscera, and pass out, through the body. And that takes a while. And so there's this feeling of discomfort, like you have gas, but the gas is not passing because it's not inside the intestine. Anyway, so those are things I didn't know about, but I found out later just by reading and such. And gradually, it was about, for me, between 1 to 2 weeks, and I was basically back to normal, driving, moving around, and so forth. Within a month for sure, I was back to my normal routine of craziness, of exercise like I do and everything else. And this is 16 years later. So it's the living proof, and she's still happy and peachy keen with her. Well, of course, that didn't take away the stroke or any of the other conditions. She had hypertension also, but at least the kidney is functioning perfectly. And 16 years. It's amazing. Exactly. And therefore, what I'm trying to say by this is that the proof that it can be done. One can donate a kidney and keep on living at least for 60 more years so far. Good. And then, so let me stop for a moment. People have questions or comments. Then we go forward.
Question is, because I mentioned about the surgeon being in another room, Dr. Martinez, in Enrique's case, the doctor was in another room too.
They don't have to be in another room, that just depends on the setup of the joystick system. So ORs have a finite size. And they have to have some area that's consistently sterile. So they, depending on how old the ORs are, they weren't built for as much equipment as we have nowadays. So sometimes they move some of the equipment that's not necessarily sterile to other areas. But basically what happens is this machine is connected just like a video game to the joystick and either joystick or ball or both. And then they'll do certain manipulations and the machine will react to it. That's why it's a robot. So it could be right next to it.
It could be next to it. Or
But
could be,
yeah,
yeah.
And in the biggest case, for some difference, because the bath, they have, you know.
Oh, no, I know, I mean, I looked at videos of the
Procedure, yeah. Mhm.
He didn't want to know what he was gonna happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And to this day, he's like, no, 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 no.
Yeah. Right, yeah, there's the yucky factor, you know, the queasy factor. Some people like to, some people really get into it, others not at all. But it's all recorded also, and you can see it later, and there are many videos online that you can see now of all these procedures.
I mean, I know you weren't, but Enrique was in, what do you call it? Common.
Induced coma, yes,
With the heart,
right,
but
Yeah.
it's, again, it's a very little. incision.
yes, it's a catheter, right, it's a catheterization.
Is that what it is?
10 centimeters, yeah, of
Right
length,
here. And the main reason what I understand that Dr. Lamela said that Dr. Martinez is a cardiologist, said that when they do an open heart,
yeah,
it takes longer to heal here, so. if
Right.
patients- I don't know if in
Yeah.
all the cases can be done that way.
so they go what, through the jugular or,
I don't know,
if you do an incision, they did an incision.
but right here, it's right here. Somewhere here.
on the neck?
There's different ways of
Techniques.
doing the valve surgery, so there's I think the Dr. Lamel likely did was a minimally invasive.
Yes, that's the one.
And what they do is the heart is between the lungs, so what they'll do is they'll make an incision and drop the lung.
Oh,
So get it out of the way of the heart, and
I
then they're
see.
able to access the
Right.
heart through one side or the
Ah.
other.
okay,
Usually they go through the right side.
all right.
And
Uh-huh.
then, again, they'll go through the right ventricle and get to the left ventricle through the intraatrial septum.
Oh,
Be able
okay,
to replace the mitral valve,
wow,
but you also saw there is a transcatheter
uh-huh,
version of this where they would go up the groin
okay,
and, the valve can be deployed. And this is more common nowadays with the aortic valve through a catheter, and so the incision's down in the leg. And they do have one for the mitral valve. And
Mhm.
there's another, do the same thing on the left side, you can drop the left lung and go what's called transapical.
Uh-huh.
Tip of the
the
heart
epics,
and,
right,
and get into the left heart directly.
wow,
Anatomically, the right heart is in front of the left heart.
oh, I see, so it's a little
So it's
gyrated.
actually, you're getting behind it,
Mhm.
that's all.
So it depends which valve. they
It
need
depends
to-
which valve you're doing,
Yeah.
how you can do it, and the
That's
techniques
approach.
involved enormously in the valves are involved enormously. It
Yes.
depends on the type of valve that you do and so on. And you
Mhm.
can actually use the Da Vinci.
Awesome.
To a certain extent
Yes.
for bypass surgery and
Wow.
for some of the valve surgeries.
Mhm.
But again, the recovery
Mhm.
has a little bit more to do with the hemodynamics
I see,
and
okay,
making sure that the person is able to breathe
right,
after the procedure.
breathe and coagulate,
And they
Everything.
already, like, it was operated at 8 o'clock in the morning, they end like at 1 of this or something like that,
the same day,
yeah,
eating.
and he was.
Well, that's an anesthesia, right?
you're sure that they're okay.
Right.
They disconnecting and they get.
Right. Yeah.
And then the next morning,
Uh-huh.
they make him walk.
Stand up, yes, yeah, it's very proactive,
Yeah,
to get the body,
activity is key to everything.
right,
They try to
right.
get you going. As opposed to before we're convalescent.
Yes. It is very proactive today. Typically, standard 24 hours after surgery, sometimes even major surgery. They want you out the door for a number of reasons, but hopefully it's patient-centered, right? That they're asking the body to react and start healing.
And you always, if you're able to recover better at home than you do in the hospital, just because of the general view. The
Yes,
hospital's an artificial, you don't need.
that's
correct.
correct.
Sit in a chair, you can sleep in the right bed.
Yes, not always get the right attention because of shortage and this and that and bureaucracy. People coming in and out also, that's the other thing. At night, it's hard to sleep in the hospital. And also the superbugs for sure. Just a big one.
So the drive is to get more people home, and one of the things that is coming down the pike is
Wow, altogether, huh?
which is a flip backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Because back in the day, the house was the best place to treat folks,
Uh-huh,
and and the hospital was reserved for those people who could be treated.
Could
didn't
not
have a
be.
house.
yes, right. So we probably developed too much dependency
Now,
on the
right,
hospital setting and the
and
clinical
the
setting.
hospital setting, and then that's created a lot of different problems.
Right, yeah,
And it became a little bit more obvious, during COVID,
oh, yes, big time.
when people couldn't go to the hospital, they couldn't go to the room, and
Mhm.
they were covering.
There you go.
And
Telemedicine and.
Yes.
monitoring, all that stuff, showed
Yeah.
that they had the capacity.
Well, now that you bring that up, all the research that must be going on, still ongoing and analyzing all the data of that situation, right? That out of a crisis situation.
Fortunately, it's become significantly politicized.
Yes.
And lost an
Yeah.
increasing amount of opportunity.
Yeah. Yes, that layer, and we all lived it as it was happening, right? Because it involved also presidential elections, this country and then globally, and interactions with other nations. I mean, it was really a moment of crisis for the world. Well, I'll cover some of that when we get into the pandemics, but I think, okay.
Let's tell you a quick differential.
Mhm.
Africa, the African continent,
Mhm.
has over 80% natural immunity.
wow.
Yes.
They never got the vaccine.
Yes,
The United States has about 40.
wow. Affable.
So the. and
With-
we have
with a
over
massive
70%
campaign.
vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
In combination.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting population. And you can see how different reaction, how the virus evolved and all in a natural immunity environment versus
Yeah.
an induced.
Right, okay, so well, we have a lot of talking to do also for the pandemic viruses, right? But all these issues coming up.
That's a historic on transplant. Okay, so there may have been prior, I'm sure there were, but one of the ones that I'm aware of comes from Saint Cosmo and Damien, who transplanted a cadaveric leg onto a living person.
Really, no kidding, okay. Yeah, okay, that was Cosmos and Damien, they go back to the early centuries of the church, I forget exactly how. Yeah.
They did that.
Well, it didn't come out of.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, that's the tradition,
That's,
Dr. Sullivan mentioned about the Second World War was from, I don't remember.
Oh, Sandra, I mean,
One of them, I remember,
yeah,
it was, and Father Chuck clarified to me today, because about the transition from patient, paternalistic,
oh,
to patient.
patient-centered, right, or patient autonomy,
Yes.
yeah, versus paternalist, the models. Dr. O'Sullivan, I think, speaks about one. With it, Vizcarrondo, yes, also, because we're looking at the same from either the patient perspective or the doctor perspective. Yes. Mm-hmm. Here they are. They- I know. It's so easy. I'm utilitarian when it comes to Wikipedia. Yes, it's true. It's true. But they go back to the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century. Cilicia, Middle East.
The picture. We're holding up urine, but that was a big deal.
Oh, yes, right, okay.
So make a lot of that.
Diagnosis from the quality of the urine, wow.
So what was the thing, what they thought?
And the apothecary of the,
Parent.
according to tradition, we say, or
Oh,
tradition.
yes, practice medicine, surgery without a fee. Oh,
Mhm.
they did surgery.
Oh, that's they. And they-
Have that.
And those lines of doctors made surgery, every doctor makes it.
Yeah.
But that's why they.
Yeah, well, again, if you listen to Dr. Sullivan, she goes all the way back to Egypt.
Yeah. And she says about.
Yes, also Bible. And the trepanation to relieve pressure from the brain, trepanations.
And she said, this is what's interesting. I don't want to go off too far off.
Too much.
She said that happened, like 6,000 years ago.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking, but the onset of civilization wasn't 6,000 years.
Well, no, it would be because it's 7,000 BC,
7,000.
right?
Okay.
It makes it 9,000 years ago when we put the 2,000 years of the Christian era.
They said that they cure blindness, fever, paralysis, breast serpent, right?
That thing spelled aggressive.
A breast serpent. Okay. Again, this is, yes, right. Maybe it was erysipelas, what do you call that? The right, shingles type, Yeah. or a worm.
And they
Anyway.
Okay,
You can look it up.
You can look it up.
That's
see. I would have said something completely different.
yeah. Okay, so my last 2 points here, one on the living and one on the dead, is that for living transplant, specifically for liver, for kidney. I did the math back then. The little article I sent you, that's the one that I published on it. And I did the math back then. If we take the 100,000 and we consider the population of adults back then, I think it came out to 0.1%. 0.1% of the adult population of the United States were to donate a kidney, we will wipe out the 100,000 people on the list. Not even 1%, but 0.1%. Okay, 0.1% of the adult population of the US. It's incredible.
What you did, it was.
But what? But that's my question is, why is it incredible? Why do people consider it incredible? I mean, here I am. It was some discomfort for a couple of weeks. And there is a certain level of risk. But I tell you, I've been living in Miami for 52 years. Every time I drive just 20 blocks from here to St. Monica Parish through Miami Gardens, my life is at risk at a much higher percentage than this kidney donation thing. Every time I drive through there, I see people cutting me from the left all the way across 3 lanes, or they're coming over here, they're using the turn lane to get in front of the other cars. Absolutely crazy. So I really have to, I wish I could turn my neck 360 degrees to see who's coming, because it's not the people who's in front of me, it's the people behind me also. And anywhere we drive, you know, the risk of health or life is greater. 95, the Palmetto Expressway, you name it. So it's something to consider. It's just that it's the perception, right? We live in 2 worlds simultaneously. the world of reality and the perception of reality. And I'm thinking this is one of those cases where the perception of reality doesn't necessarily match the actual reality of a kidney donation. I'm thinking, maybe I'm naive about it, but I'm thinking that it's much simpler than people actually make it to be.
And it will get probably more cost effective.
And for the, yeah, I mean, the bang for the buck, no, the benefits of it, essentially you're saving another person's life. It doesn't have to be someone you know. You can also donate anonymously, you know, and send it into the list.
This is from my insurance plan.
Uh-huh.
Insurance, again, I'm talking US. In the United States, insurance is driven by one's propensity to be risk averse. And so we have insurance for this country.
Right.
Because we can't understand or tolerate loss.
Yes.
So one of the components with doing something is you have to have a non-risk averse personality doing it. Because people are risk averse, hence insurance. That's a very popular economic vehicle in the United States because our society tends to be.
I see. I see.
People like
Okay.
to
Interesting. To take risks, right?
take
Yes.
risks. Now
Yes.
they take risks all the time, but they don't do it knowing. Like I said, they
Exactly.
cross the street, they ride
Yes.
on an airplane.
Yes. Or for convenience, they compromise subconsciously for convenience or whatever. And they are taking risks without really knowing.
without
Ignorance is
knowing.
bliss.
The difference with medicine is, well,
Mhm.
you're supposed to tell them everything that
Right.
needs to happen.
Right.
And so when they hear like, oh, what the hell? They're always like, it's gonna happen to me, so I'm not gonna do it. So that's one of the components. The other component, and going through the
Mhm.
financials of it,
Yes.
this is probably one of the most expensive risk components for the insurance,
Okay.
so they don't promote it.
I see.
So
Okay,
it's
they
not-
play it
they don't
down.
Make a smooth road for
Uh-huh.
you to, oh, now it's your turn and go.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
yeah.
I
The-
see.
the
Okay.
University of Miami, Jackson, so on, or other kinds of, are very adroit at being able to work the system so that eventually, but it is not an easy path, sometimes it's a stumbling block.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I see. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. The insights from the financial side and the insurance, because after all, we're in a market economy, right? And it has to play the market.
But then on the other hand, having all these people in dialysis, also it's very expensive. So.
But relatively speaking, because you know that's a procedure that has been around for decades and it's really been optimized and so forth. Sometimes now there's even a take-home dialysis that can be done overnight. I don't know that every patient qualifies, but it's available.
I understand what you're saying, but
Mm.
I'm saying wouldn't be more. Will save some of the costs if more of us will donate. To kind of finish the whatever you call
Yeah.
this pandemic or I don't know how you call it.
Right. I think it's interesting you bring that up because that's an argument that I use, for example, for saving the cord blood stem cells. Because I'm thinking that in the long run, having those stem cells saved may procure cures for the donor, or the baby who is now grown up, right? However, the insurance for some reason is not picking it up yet. They haven't seen the benefit to the risk.
Don't listen to my talk.
It's
Um,
a very deep talk.
the way the insurance companies work is by panels. So the panel and the budget is year on year, if not quarter on quarter, but usually year on year. So if I have a particular panel this year, 2023, my cost effectiveness is determined by what the panel starts off in size being and what my cost is at the end of the year.
Mm,
So if I have, and I'm not good at math,
right.
perspective, but let's say I have 100 members and they each pay $100 a year,
Mhm.
right? So I know I have $100,000 at the end of the year. That's all,
Right.
that's my budget for that year.
That's the budget.
If I spend $110,000, I'm
Right,
negative
beyond.
$10,000.
Right.
If I spend
Under-
$50,000, I make a $50,000 profit.
Mhm,
Okay? So if I have a transplant which occurred 1 year,
mhm,
and that transplant cost me $200,000,
mhm. Wow.
I've lost
Wow.
100% of my profit.
Uh-huh. Exactly.
Okay? So that's the way they see it.
Yes, by the
The
numbers.
next year,
Mhm,
I don't care, because next year is next year, and you may not be in my panel,
mhm.
so flip a coin.
I see.
And
Okay.
so that's the way.
So
they
it's within the year. what
Right,
happens
so
within
it's
that year.
taken federal legislation
Mhm,
and insurance legislation to make the insurance companies be more proactive in outcome care.
mhm.
But that was not the intrinsic component. So
I
now the
see.
insurance companies have, but it's still year to year, have to submit what their outcome, how many people of yours had a heart attack, how many people
Yeah.
of yours are with renal failure,
Yeah.
how many people of yours at the hospital. And
So it's
on.
just, it eventually it becomes also a statistical problem, a probabilistic
is,
problem,
it is.
because they're playing by the numbers. Of course, volume is what makes the profit, right?
Exactly.
Volume. If I sell one soda bottle, or if I sell 1,000 soda bottles, you know, it's costing the same basically to produce them, each one, and I have the machinery for making 1 or 1,000. But again, just kind of thinking out loud, maybe beyond a year is too iffy to
Exactly.
speculate. The further out I go from the year, the more margin of error I have. And so I may not hit the target. There are more factors that are going to get me off the target. So they don't want to risk going beyond a year's frame
Exactly.
of estimates. Right. So that, yeah, that's why the budget is done on a yearly basis. So they can do maybe a 5-year budget, but how realistic is that, or how reliable? It's a 5-year budget, right?
That most healthcare,
Mhm,
most outside of the insurance,
mhm.
but most healthcare is driven on a 3-year cycle
I see.
because of what's called the allowed depreciation.
Oh,
So what happens is if I buy this phone and I'm a hospital,
mhm,
I'm allowed to depreciate the cost of the phone for the next 3 years. After
mhm.
that, then it's no longer quantitated. So if I keep the phone, it's fine, but I'm no longer depreciating it. So that's how they can account for it.
Oh, okay.
So there's account.
Yes. I think some of that, yeah, I think some of that is standardized because I understand that, for example, cars, it's very similar, right? The 3 years, the biggest depreciation, and then after that, might as well keep it because you're not gonna get your money's worth out of it if you turn it in or sell it. Mhm. Okay, well, that's part, it ties into the market economy one way or another. Yeah. All right, folks, the last thing I want to bring up is, oh, no, before I get on this one, then I promise I will get off on this topic. But when I published this article, the little article that I sent you from the NCBC, right? I was also making a case there at the end, specifically an appeal to priests and nuns to be donors, to consider being donors for this reason. First of all, our lives are simpler in the sense that not that many people depend on us, in contrast to a spouse with children or even with just a spouse, right? So it's simpler that way. That's number one. Number two, we tend to know more people, and more importantly, in this case, more people tend to know us than laity. In the case that I were to go into renal failure at some point, it would probably be a little easier for me to get a donor than for a private individual who is depending mostly on their family. Example, if I announced at a parish, for example, tomorrow that I'm going on renal failure, if someone is willing to consider giving me a kidney, I think people might be, maybe I'm being naive, but I think people might be more in tune to donating a kidney to a priest or nun than to another anonymous person. Maybe I'm being idealistic there. Too much self-esteem. Oh, finally, he's on kidney failure. We'll get a new pastor. It could be that, right? But anyway, I was promoting it for priests and nuns also because of the altruism and because of the symbolism. of it, right? Because this would make it graphically that yes, definitely the church, the Catholic Church is promoting organ donation if it's ethical and can be done. And I remember distinctly John Paul II making an appeal for that. He even had, I think at some point, a document on it. But every modern pope has spoken favorably about it and so forth. So that's why I was appealing particularly to priests and nuns, and especially the window, I would say, like generally in their 50s, going forward from the 50s in age, because I think now they take them up to about 70s, in the 70s, all right? So again, they're getting more risky there, but certainly 50s and 60s is a good time. Basically, we've lived at least half of our lives already, right? So hopefully we've accomplished something. And so if we go into failure in the latter part of our lives, well, we were going into the third stage of life anyway. So we're supposed to prepare for transition, the other transition, the big transition, the real one. Anyway, so that was the article there. I invite you to read it. And also it happens that in this cohort of the 7 of you, 3 happen to be priests, fellow priests. So fellow priests, think about it and talk about it with your peer, with your friend priest, and let's see what happens. I know one bishop has actually who read the article and he was motivated by it. He did donate the kidney, reading the article that I wrote. So, yeah, actually a bishop actually is the only one that I know of. But anyway, so it's there. Consider it. Consider it. You know, you can talk about it with your family anyway. It's a nice piece of conversation.
It certainly will be a topic of conversation now. Okay,
excellent. And by the way, you always look for the silver lining. If you have that conversation, it also counts for internship hours. You may be able to get more than 1 hour out of this one. The last point I wanted to mention is with regards to the deceased donor. All right. See, once there is a declaration of brain death, total brain death, the person has been declared dead. Technically, we no longer have a person as such. We don't have a person. Now we have a cadaver. It's a human cadaver. All right. But sometimes that human cadaver is hooked up to a support system to maintain some organs alive, specifically the lung and the heart. All right. So they will start heparinizing the blood inside the body and keeping that heart with the vent and the lungs active for some time. It may be a few hours until the transplant is actually until the harvesting is done. So we're not keeping a dead person alive. Very important that the words have meaning. We're not keeping a dead person alive. The dead person has died, so we no longer have a person as such. All right, we have a human cadaver, which vital organs are being kept alive until the harvesting may be done. Okay, so that's the vascular support, the vent and the vascular support that is offered. But it's not keeping a dead person alive, because then we have problems.
Oh, yeah.
You know, if we're harvesting a kidney, a heart from a person who is alive, you know, they're either dead or alive. So keep in mind this, because this could be part of that yucky factor. How come if my loved one has been declared dead, how come they're still breathing? And how come their heart is still beating? Well, that's precisely why. The heart and the lungs are alive, but there's no integration because the brain is dead, totally dead.
But they're kept alive with machines, right?
They, who's they?
I mean, no, I mean, when I mean.
They, the heart and the lungs, but not the person, because the person is no longer there.
But it's just machines.
It's machine, yeah, it's a vascular
It's not-
support.
it's not
Yeah.
That your body is providing that because you're dead.
Correct, right. So this, in a sense, the vascular support, well, I think I raised a word here. The vascular, yeah.
Oops.
I messed it up there. The support is obviously artificial, it's provided. In other words, we're basically substituting the brain stem
Correct.
with machinery, equipment, electricity, etc., whatever is needed to maintain the heart and the lungs breathing.
When the conversation takes place, doesn't exactly mean,
That needs to be explained, right? That essentially, functionally, the brainstem is being substituted with machinery, with medical equipment for a relatively short period of time until the harvesting is done.
and if they don't find a match,
Right, well, that has to do with UNOS and OPTN, right? UNOS and OPTN. Because obviously the first thing that is done is the blood test and then go from there to find. There may be a match somewhere in the United States. Just on kidneys, there's 100,000, so imagine. And liver, I think, is the second one, and then probably lungs. However, I was talking to Dr. Moss, precisely the pulmonologist, one of the ones on the talk, is that the lung transplants for some reason are relatively rare. They are, it's more complicated than, certainly much more complicated than kidney or liver. But at least theoretically it can be done. So I think that what is done, the other thing is that for a lung, you need two donors, because they would only take, I'm talking for liver, for living donor, of the 5 lobes, they only take 1 lobe. Because they're not going to say, the argument is this: you cannot risk the health or the life of the donor, of the living donor, disproportionately to save another person's life. You know, you're not going to make one person sick to heal another person. That's against do no harm. That's against the basic principle of medicine. So it has to be, it doesn't have to have, it cannot have a significant impact, negative impact on the health of the donor. All right. So the kidney obviously is much easier to do, but in lung, so you can only take out one one lobe, because then we still have 4 other lobes that can compensate. In fact, Pope Francis is, they say he's missing a lung. He's actually, well, he's actually a lobe. I don't know how many lobes actually, but Pope Francis only has, they say, 1 lung. I don't know if it's 2 or more lobes. Obviously, 3 or 2. Yes, right. But how many? Obviously, he has some functionality because he's breathing and he's still alive, but he's sedentary. In fact, I think he lost that lung at a sports event, playing soccer when he was a youth in Argentina. It was an accident as a young kid, right? So he's been with 1 lung ever since, and there he is. It's 80, so
You need a 350cc of air exchange.
That's how to do it.
and
Minimum.
Body mass.
Okay.
So you can
Oh,
actually
so it's a
take
body
out
mass
an
thing.
entire- you have-
One. Wow. So up to 3 lobes then. The one with the 3 lobes
and
could
then
be
again, it depends on the size of your
the
lung.
size, body mass ratio to breathing. Okay, right. For the transplant, I've heard that they only take 1 lobe out, so as not to risk the life of the person and not to make them sedentary, right? But for living, for the recipient, for the patient, they need at least 2 lobes, typically 2 lobes, to be able to reach the 240 cc,
Yeah,
to
100,
around
150.
250 cc's of breathing servant. All right. And therefore, they need 2 donors, right? 2 living donors, 1 lobe each. And so it gets more complicated. But anyway, I just wanted to mention this thing of the support that is artificial. It's substituting the stem, but definitely we're dealing with a cadaver. There's no longer a person there, right? Even though they seem to be living because the chest is rising and falling and there's a pulse, right? And how can a cadaver have a pulse? Well, it can. It's temporary.
the lung and the pancreas, they regenerate.
The pancreas, I think not. At one time, there was I think Dr. Riccardi here, right? He was doing the islets of the pancreas, the pancreatic islets, to try to do living pancreas donation. But there was some complication. The patient went, like they say, they went south. The patient, the recipient did not act favorably, and the donor, so they stopped those trials. So they're having clinical trials on living pancreatic donation. But it was stopped quite a few years ago. I know because when I did mine, that was being taught at that time. It was, but the trials stopped. The pancreas, unfortunately, pancreatic cancer, right? It typically has no symptoms until it's too late, generally metastasized, and by that time it's 1 to 2 weeks normally of a window. But the pancreas is a tough one. Yeah.
The lung won't regenerate, but it will grow.
Will
So
grow.
if they take off, because what they look for is segments. So each
Ah.
lobe has a series of segments.
Oh,
So
within.
they can do multiple segment technique,
Oh,
and what's left will actually
expand within that.
within
to
that to
take
regain some.
within the lobe itself. Fantastic. Yeah.
But it won't grow new. It's
Right, no new one.
it's
Yeah,
like
I can't
brain,
wait.
you know, brain.
Yeah. Some of us lose a lot of it. We still function. Yeah, in fact, my kidney has grown a little bit. Yeah, it has grown a little bit. Once a year, or when I have my checkup, my annual checkup with the urologist, he always asks for a sonogram of both kidneys, and I always get around, but I say with a very straight face of the tech, is it coming back? You see, is it growing? It started growing yet? You know, I says, what do you mean? First, I don't say anything in that it's solitary kidney, so they keep looking for it. Oh, I forgot to tell you, it's not there. But is it growing back? It's kind of, yeah, cruel jokes. But all right, folks. So there it is. We've gone from the sublime to the ridiculous, obviously, but this is the one that I wanted to give simply because of the testimony. Think about it, put it in prayer, pass it on, and the Holy Spirit will do the rest. Thank you again for your attention on this. We go forward now. Actually, I do have my little black book to tell you for the pandemic, since I keep mentioning it. It's did we schedule it in yet? Yes, we have. Oh, here it is, April 29. Okay, so if you want to write it down for the pandemics bioethics, April 29. And until then, you're still on your own, watching those videos, doing the internship hours, and getting your regalia for the commencement.
For the internship, it's set up as a particular semester.
Yes,
Is it last semester or this
which
semester?
just happened. I haven't told you anything because, okay, let me finish the recording because it's a technical thing, but folks online can still stay if you want. I'm just going to finish the recording for the lecture itself, okay? So give me a minute. Stop recording.